Can I welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Transport Committee? In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session, and I will also introduce each guest as they join us. Our main discussion today will be on how COVID-19 is shaping public transport provision, followed by a session on London Travel Watch. Everyone is encouraged to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag Assembly Transport. I would like to ask the Clerk, Laura Pelling, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence.
Chair, we've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Eshalomi. We have the following members attending today's meeting. Yourself, Chair, Assembly Member Moore, the Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Devonish, Assembly Member Curtin, Assembly Member McCartney, Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member Russell and Assembly Member Shah.
Could I ask everyone to check their electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid any interruptions, and that during our Q&A session, microphones are set to me until you are called to speak. Item number 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any other declarations? Can we note the list of declarations in the report?
Noted.
Thank you. Item number 3 is minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Transport Committee held on the 15th of June 2020 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item number 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the summary list of actions and correspondence sent by me as chair?
Noted.
Thank you. And number 5, action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the action taken under delegated authority as set out in the report?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you. So we will now move on to our question and answer session. As I said, shaping public transport provision and how COVID-19 is impacting on that. We have 3 sections of questions. The first on the impact of COVID-19 on the transport network, the second on the 3R framework and London Streetspace programme, and the third on future planning. As ever with Transport Committee, we have a full meeting, and I want to make sure that we make the most of our guests' time. Without curtailing debate, I will keep us to time and move us on when that's necessary. Not least because we want to make sure we do Travel Watch justice in the last part of the meeting. And so can I welcome our guests today, Dr. Will Norman, who is the Walking and Cycling Commissioner, Alex Williams, Director of City Planning for TfL, Councillor Julian Bell, who is the former Chair of London Council's Transport Environment Committee and representative on TfL, and Nicole Batstuber, who is a Transport Policy and Travel Behaviour Researcher at University College London and the University of Westminster. And moving on, I will take the first question in the first set, and this is addressed specifically or particularly to Will Norman, and we will address questions to individuals. Of course, you have the opportunity of other guests coming in if that's appropriate. So to Will, what networks have been used to encourage the shift to staggered opening times, and how receptive have businesses been in adjusting to those staggered times?
TfL, and I'm sure Alex Williams will want to come in on this from a TfL perspective as well. So TfL have been engaging businesses, employers, a huge number of people. They've been writing to business groups and organisations. We've been using the Oyster travel data to communicate directly with customers, to inform people about the changing patterns of use. We've been writing, I think we've written to over 300 different schools in terms of that approach to moving that. I know I personally have had meetings with collections of the London business improvement districts to talk about how COVID is changing the public transport system, how people move around the city. So there's a huge amount of engagement going on through all the different networks, different stakeholders, MPs. I know we've been talking to many of your colleagues, people on the Assembly. We're trying to do our utmost to communicate through every channel we have available to us to talk about how we can spread the peak. As Tony mentioned, you know, the return to travel on the tube isn't as busy as it used to be, but we are seeing the numbers and the numbers of journeys increasing. I think the tube's up by about 20% of what it was last year. It's sort of increasing sort of 3-4% every day in terms of that. Bus travel, I think, is about 40 to 50% of what it had been in the past. So we're seeing the numbers grow. What we want to avoid is people traveling on those peak, nobody wants to return to those very crowded buses and tubes in the morning peak, in the afternoon, and in the evening peak. So the trick is to talk to everybody, look at how we can stagger start times, how we can change behaviours to spread those peaks for those people who still have to travel. I'm sure Alex has got more information in terms of some of the communications that TfL have been doing, including the boroughs.
Yeah, happy to come in, Chair, if that would help.
That would be really helpful, thank you. And while you're doing that, perhaps you could also answer the a sort of second question that I've got is, how has this translated into travel patterns on TfL networks? Now, Will has answered some of that, but you might like to fill in on that as well.
So very happy to. I think the key thing really is that at each stage of lockdown release, we have engaged with the relevant sectors ahead of that lockdown release to provide bespoke information and advice to them. So ahead of the schools partial reopening in June, we provided advice to every school in the capital, 3,000 schools, on the travel advice about avoid public transport, walk and cycle, stagger journey times, that kind of thing. Probably the best example I can quote is ahead of the opening of non-essential retail in mid-June. And ahead of that, we engaged with all the business improvement districts all over London about what they should prepare for that reopening. And a key message that we were keen to get across at that time was avoid the busiest times, because what we've seen is very strong peaks of travel in the early morning and kind of 5 p.m. time in the evening, but a lot of capacity in the interpeak. So our advice to the non-essential retail was to start later and finish later, so avoid the morning peak and avoid the evening peak. And what was really pleasing, and certainly in the conversations with NWEC in central London, they provided a lot of information about the start and opening times of retail, and they were listening to that. They were start opening later and finishing later, and I think us starting today at 11 is a good example of that as well. And in terms of what effect that's had, certainly when we've looked at the hourly flows going through some of the stations, say on Oxford Street, we are seeing that the peaks have not increased, but the interpeak has increased in terms of people using it at that 11, 12, 2 p.m. and also after the 5 p.m. peak. So it does look tentatively, I should say, that certainly on the non-essential retail, that people are responding to that advice about using the network at different times. The other thing I should highlight is that what we're all focused on now is September, because all schools going back, all universities and further education is going back later in September. That is a big challenge. And there's a lot of work now to make sure that we encourage the education sector to look at that issue about staggering journey times as well, because just shifting it by half an hour for the start and finish time would have a profound impact on how the bus network in particular operates in outer London. So a lot has been done, but a lot more to do on this area.
And hopefully actually individual schools working with neighbours as well to stagger their times, which has been done in some areas, I know. So if I could carry on with you, Alex, I mean, what impact on traffic levels is TfL seeing in response to the increased road user charges and the extended operational hours? What impact has that been having?
Well, it's worth just giving you a kind of general sense about where we are, because what at the height of the pandemic, tube ridership was down to around 5% of norm, and on the road network we were down to around a third of norm. We're now back in a situation where road traffic is around 90% of normal levels, and tube ridership is around 25% of normal levels. So we are very concerned about this issue of what we call about a car-led recovery. In central London, As you know, we turned off the congestion charging scheme in March. We turned it back on in middle May, 18th of May, and we extended the hours and days of operation on the 22nd of June. So it's still very early days to kind of draw out conclusions about what's happening there. But the initial data indicates that during the week, flows into central London reduced by 8%, and at the weekend it's by 27%. But as I say, this is a scheme that's only been in a matter of weeks, so we will be kind of tracking that and seeing it. But the initial data are those two figures: 8% weekday, 27% weekend.
Okay. And that obviously, that picture will change. So, I mean, to all of you, I guess, there's talking about changing and how you might remodel or make changes to the system or the rules. So, a question that's been asked of a number of us is, should TfL consider allowing non-folded bikes on trains and the tube during those former peak periods to promote further cycling? And would you consider changing the seat layout to fit in more bikes?
Well, I take that one to begin with. So at the moment, I think everybody's clear. Folding bikes can be taken on the tube at any time. So Bromptons and other makes are available. There is, obviously it's down to the discretion of the TfL staff on stations if it's overly busy or if it's difficult to get onto the trains. Non-folding bikes can be taken on large sections of TfL's tube and rail network at the moment, but as you said, it's not at peak times, it's at non-peak times. And that's at large sections of the District Line, and I haven't got all this in my head, but I know it's District Circle, Met, and Hammersmith and City, which are the ones that tend to run overground. Some of the outer sections of the Central Line, the DLR and overground, you can use them as well as on TfL rail. The central section is where you are less, the central section and the deep, particularly the deep underground tubes, are where the non-folding bikes are not allowed. There are two reasons for that. One is that there's a limit on capacity on those trains, and we don't, folding trains at busy times is a difficult, which is why we don't allow them on peak for most of the places. But the key thing is safety, and getting access to those deeper tubes is largely by escalators. That's not safe, bringing a lot of bikes down there. Secondly, in terms of evacuating trains in an emergency, in terms of those deep tunnels, those emergency procedures, we don't want bicycles getting in the way of that. So both of those reasons, the capacity issue, but also key safety issues, still apply given the COVID crisis, as is anything else. There are no plans to change that at the moment. But I agree, I wish I could have a really simple, pithy answer that you can take non-folded bikes on the tube on this time. That doesn't exist. It varies on line by line. What I would suggest, and I can share it, there is a very helpful tube map, I think, on the TfL website, which I'm really happy to share with committee members.
Sorry, let me just turn this other thing off. I'm more than happy, obviously, to pass that through to Jill.
Oh, well, I'm more than happy to pass through the tube map of what lines can be done where, on what lines you can take it, because I can't give a fully comprehensive answer of which lines and which hours off the top of my head, but I will share that information with members, and if people want to disseminate that more broadly, I think it's important. One of the things I would say is that I think it's important that we try and increase people cycling to stations and then taking walking and cycling journeys out the other end, rather than trying to encourage more people to take their bikes on trains themselves because of that limited capacity. Physically changing tube trains and overground trains is expensive, it's time consuming, there are other pressures on that network. For me, what we kind of need to do is make sure that there is space on that network for those people who can't walk and cycle, and provide better parking for solutions at stations, particularly in outer London, increased bike hire, better walking routes in those central London, so that those active journeys can be part of a journey rather than everybody lugging bicycles, tandems, and heaven knows what onto the tube system, which I don't think is a smart way of using what limited space we have got available just at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you for that. It's something I think we will return to in terms of just understanding where those constraints are. But I think encouraging people maybe who could feel like they could try to cycle one way or part of their journey might be an answer. But let's see how this plays out, because I think it's the more we can encourage people to consider bike as part of their route, the better. I mean, both to you and to Alex. We're aware of changes to the TfL journey planner, and those do flag up and prioritise walking and cycling, certainly up to 40 minutes. The question I think for all of us is, can you influence the routes planned by other applications like Citymapper or Google that we all use, and obviously are part of our journey planning?
So you're right. We have been, given the sort of the increased need for more people to walk and cycle during this time, to make space on the roads and the rail and tubes and buses for people who can't. We have been doing quite a lot on our journey planner and on the website. So that includes putting the new infrastructure on, new bike parking facilities, and one of the key things that's changed is that if you now go onto Journey Planner and you put in a inquiry for a journey that I think it's less than 8 kilometers, it will show the first option as a walking and cycling option. So it's part of that sort of behavior change nudge mentality of showing, look, the cycling is available, and we're trying to improve that as we move on. But as you said, not everybody uses Journey Planner as their mechanism of navigating London. There's Citymapper, Google Maps is really popular. Obviously Apple, which goes to the Apple phones. There's various other schemes. What we are, there are other apps and providers. What we've been doing is, as you'll know, we've been doing a lot of, most of TfL's data is open data and is shared, and there are various what are called APIs, so that changes to that data set automatically go out to other providers. We have been putting the new cycling routes and that data onto those other apps. I've met, and I asked actually Apple Maps and Google Maps to come for a meeting in London before this crisis to discuss this in detail. So they flew over from the West Coast. We discussed that with them in detail. One of the challenges working with the really big technological, so the big boys, the Apples and the Googles, is that they are keen to make sure that what happens in one city is scalable, is replicable in other cities. And so it depends on data sets, which makes that more challenging. They've agreed to work with us. We're feeding them information, but I think the outputs aren't always perfect. Citymapper, we're putting that information through there, as well as the sort of cycle streets open data, open source data. So that is all happening. The other thing that we have been doing is we created a digital infrastructure database for cycling. So it's the first time we pulled together all the on-street information, everything from bike lanes to bike parking spaces to, you name it, anything to do with cycling, all on one digital database that is now getting updated through volunteers, as well as through boroughs, as well as through TfL. And it's interesting, once we put that data out, there are new apps saying, well, actually, we can use that in a new way, coming up with some brilliant sort of algorithms to say, well, if you want a fast route, this is one way of doing it. If you want a slow, safer route, this is the way to do it. If you're interested in doing all of this on road, that's one way of doing it. If you're wanting to take some of the off-street routes, such as parks or canals, this is one way of doing it. So the more open data we put out there, the more imagination some of these brilliant software developers are doing. And we're trying to work as much as possible in partnership with them, because we know that, obviously planning a journey, as well as having the sort of turn-by-turn data, is important to get particularly new people cycling, because otherwise it does become quite complicated. And secondly, I would have, it's not all digital. We also have the signage on the street, and that I remember going out for a bike ride with Caroline and Keith and showing them how the wayfinding works. At every junction, there should be a turn. Now, every so often a sign gets knocked off or something gets covered up. So if people do report problems with the signage, there's a mechanism on the TfL website of reporting that, and we can look into fixing it.
And in the longer term, hopefully we can have some digital messaging as well around that, but that's not for right now, I guess. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. I was going to move on and ask Navin Navin Shah to pick up the next two questions. But Alex, have you got anything to add before we move on?
No, I think Will's answer was very comprehensive. I think, I suppose the other thing is he might have said, I might have missed it, apologies, is that there's a huge amount of change being delivered on our road network at the moment. And I think one of the challenges we've got is making sure that the mapping systems kind of keep up to date with all of that change. Huge amount of borough delivery and our delivery. And that's what we're trying to do with Google Maps. So, for example, and our journey planner as well. So, for example, the new cycle lane on Park Lane, that is available on Google Maps. And I think as soon as these new facilities come online, we need to make sure that those various app providers are aware of them and are telling customers out there that they can use these facilities.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And thank you for your answers. And Navin, could I move on to you then for the next two questions?
Yeah,
There
thank
you
you,
go.
Chair, and good morning to our guests. My question is to start with Will and Alex, and it's on social distancing and capacity on the tube. If we can all use public transport, we have been encouraged to go back to work. So how will TfL manage social distancing of 1 meter, given they can only operate at 25% capacity? Alex.
Thank you, Navin. That is the big kind of difficult issue that we're facing in London and indeed what cities are grappling with all over the world, I think, really. And it's quite interesting if you look at the kind of history about how we've responded to this pandemic. At the height of the pandemic, we were carrying around 5% of our normal flows. So on a normal day, we take around 4 million people. We were carrying around as little as 200,000 people on our network. And it's quite interesting that even then, there were occasionally trains, tube trains, that were busier than they should be, in terms of, 30, 40% full and things like that for a few stops. And for me, I think that highlights the challenge we've got on a mass transit public transport system, is that we are not going to be always 100% able to manage social distancing on that network for every train carriage, for every stop on the network. It's so fluid and so complicated that I think it becomes a challenge that's too difficult to cope with. And that, I think, has been acknowledged by government. I think they've recognised that social distancing is not always possible on a mass transit public transport system. On the buses, we haven't got caps on the tube network. We have on the buses. They were 10 on a single decker and 20 on a double decker. They've now increased from to 10 to 15 on a single and 20 to 30. But I do think we're in a kind of quite fluid situation, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if the government's advice changes or evolves as this pandemic evolves and as they take on board more public health research. And it's quite interesting if you think about how London compares with other cities around the world. On our tubes, we're around 20-25% of normal ridership. In Paris, it's around 45% of ridership. Brussels, 45% of ridership. Madrid, 40% of ridership, I think it is. And they're in a similar stage that we're at in terms of the pandemic, but they've got slightly different nuanced advice in terms of messaging and also advice about what is acceptable on the network. With a face covering in France, every seat is available for use, and that's an acceptable way of running the network. We might well get into that position over the next few months as well. I don't know. I just think that the reality of about a mass transit system is it's very difficult to manage it in an absolute sense, to say we'll always be managing social distancing. But I think, and there needs to be a kind of reality check about what we can do there. But I just think the guidance will probably change and evolve over the next few months, really. And it's quite interesting, I think, if you think about the Prime Minister's announcement last Friday, that is the first change in many ways. I'm saying, don't use public transport. They're saying, you can use public transport and we want you to go back to work. So I think it is changing. And I think one of the things we are going to look at is the messaging within our stations. At the moment, our stations have got a lot of messaging in there about the 2 meters, and they used to have messaging about avoid public transport. Now we've taken that away, but I just think it's it is always a challenge, but the messaging needs to evolve with the messaging from government as well.
The problem, Alex, is that if passengers breach social distancing in a big way, a large proportion of that, there's a huge element of risk here to safety. Now, and that won't breed confidence in people to travel by public transport. So, I mean, you said you're quite rightly you're focusing for September. So, is there something else more than messaging that you can do to sort of have that capacity that we need, but at the same time not breach? I agree. Messages from government directions, guidelines are changing, and it's fluid situation. But at the same time, it will be worrying if we are not able to maintain social distancing at the level that one would expect on mass transit, even.
Yeah, no, I completely understand the challenge, and I think there's that difficult balance between getting the economy going and back up and running, and the legitimate fears about a second wave. And I completely understand that that's a kind of circle that we're trying to square. In terms of capacity, we are running at full capacity. 95% of the tubes are running, 100% of buses, TfL rail. So the capacity is there. One of the interesting challenges we've got is that and I think it goes back to this point about messaging, is that there are plenty of times on our networks where there is absolutely stacks of capacity available, and we are nowhere near having that concern about breaching social distancing guidelines. And I think that's a key thing that we're going to be looking at in terms of messaging as we go into September, is say there are times on this network when there is lots of capacity and it is perfectly safe to use the network. I came in on a train in the peak today, and there were 3 people on my carriage. When I travelled on the tube at the weekend, there were probably 5 people on the carriage at an off-peak time. So there are plenty of times when it is safe to use the network, and it's the network has never been cleaner, ironically, in terms of the enhanced cleaning we've got out there. And I think that's the messaging we wanted to get across to people, is that think about the time you use the network, try and avoid the busiest times, and you can go into work or can go to shop and other activities, or go to school using public transport. And I just think the messaging inevitably is going to evolve between now and September, I think, and beyond.
If I can move on to my next question, and that is to Nicole and Julian. What else should TfL be considering to manage the volume and timing of travel demand? Nicole, Julian?
Sure. I mean,
Can't hear
can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. Something that some other cities are doing is using real-time loading data of their trains, which I know is possibly available for the London Overground, to tell people how busy those trains are at the moment. So, or at least use yesterday's data to and tell you how busy your journey might be as you consider setting out on that journey. So that might be something that TfL could think of if they have the data available to put out there to customers, so that people can make that informed decision before setting off on their journey.
Julian.
Yeah, just quickly, Navin. I know one of the concerns of boroughs, particularly in central London, is the nighttime economy, and kind of getting our cultural and artistic kind of economy going again. So I think good to hear from Alex that those messages outside tube stations saying don't use public transport have now gone, and so this delicate balance that we've talked about for London as a city in terms of its cultural and kind of nighttime offer, it's really important to get that part of the equation right, and how you make sure that you've given sufficient reassurance for people to start to come into central London and get that kind of leisure cultural part of the economy back going again.
Yeah, I agree on that, but there's also another additional factor, and which is for people who live in outer London areas. For them, there's not much of a choice other than going across, using public transport to get to work, who need to get to work. So there again, there's capacity issue because of social distancing. Is there something else that TfL can do in order to breed that confidence and provide safe transport journey to their place of work from outer London?
Nicole is indicating she'd like to come back in there. Thank you.
Yeah, so 2 points. First, there has been research on what the risk of getting coronavirus on public transport are, and most of that research so far is indicating that the risk is not very high in comparison to other situations. So that's probably something to keep an eye on. Obviously, having the right cleaning procedures in place and the right protection for drivers in particular is really important there, and station staff. And the second thing really that I wanted to say is around some cities have looked at adapting their networks to suit a transition out of coronavirus lockdown, or sort of a new normal, and restructure the bus network to suit those travel patterns more. So, for instance, there's this concept around having like the 15-minute neighbourhood or the 20-minute neighbourhood. So that actually is less about getting people into the central business district in central London and to work there, because it's less about commuting now, and having a transport network or public transport system that caters more for those other trips that you might be making. So, for example, those might be more orbital trips between where you live and the next neighbourhood or the next sort of urban village. And so bus trips might be much better to cater to that. Obviously, buses, of course, are more easily adaptable to changes. So I think that's something to bear in mind. Maybe the focus in this new normal isn't just about commuting into central London, but catering for those other trips that people have, catering for, getting your kids to school. And with staggered start times, that's another big challenge for working parents.
Yeah, so I have a couple of requests. Thank you very much for that, Nicole. I know Will would like to come in. And I was just going to, before you do that, Will, because I think it might be appropriate, yours and Alex's view about the using real-time loading data, because I know that was something we talked about around reimagining journeys when we were talking in June. And also, the other thing we talked about at that point was also once touching in on buses was reinstigated, you would have more data around those routes that might be more heavily used than others, and whether there was scope for any adaptation in terms of those. So real-time loading data and whether that bus data is now helping to inform. And then so Will first, and then I have Keith who'd like to come in.
I have to admit, as Walking and Cycling Commissioner, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on real-time loading data on the tube. So I'm going to pass that to Alex rather than me, Alison, because I'm probably not the best person to talk to about it.
We on the issue about loading data, we have loading data, but it's not real time. But we can have. We currently have data for yesterday, and I get kind of a daily chart showing where the pressures are on the network in terms of that real-time loading. I think, and that information is all available on our web, actually, in terms of that. People can use that if they want to develop their apps and things like that to distill that information. I think what you often find with that kind of level of detail of data is it's quite complex to grapple with and understand. And I think one of the things we have been doing is, rather than going to that level of detail, is just providing advice to localities about where their peaks are and the times to avoid, So I'll give you an example of that is for the non-essential retail opening, for the two Westfields at White City and Stratford, we provided them with data on the busiest times for the stations that serve their establishments and said, look, those are the busiest times. And with Stratford, it's a big regional station and it's not just going to be impacted by Westfield. And we said that those are the times that you need to avoid. So in terms of their messaging on their website, they have said you need to avoid those times. I think it's between 7 and 8:30 in the morning and between 5 and 6 in the afternoon at Stratford. So for me, I think it's about using that data and analysis we have and providing it in a kind of clear and coherent way to passengers and to localities to say, in your area, I'm going to give you an example. I was dealing with the business improvement for Baker Street and that area the other day, and they wanted to know their data. So we've supplied that data to them about the stations in their business improvement district so that they can provide that local advice to them. So that's what we're doing rather than line loading. It is actually distilling it down into something I think is a bit easier to digest, really. It's maybe worth going back to the point that Julian rightly raised about the nighttime economy. And I think one of the challenges there is that, central London is clearly really kind of suffering with this pandemic. And one of the struggles we've got for the nighttime economy at the moment is, concert halls aren't open, theatres aren't open, cinemas are kind of partially open, restaurants are partially open. But part of the problem in central London is that the footfall's very low. It's kind of 72%, I think, lower than normal. I think it was in Oxford Street at the weekend and during the week. Part of the reason for that is so much of their trade is people who work in the area, and the offices are empty. So I think one of the big changes from last week was the Prime Minister saying you can go back to work. And I think that's one of the things we're certainly going to be looking at is how that stimulates other employers to kind of get back into business. And the other point I'd say is on buses, we do have that data, and that is being very useful in how we plan the network. And one of the great things about the bus network is it's quite agile and we can redistribute buses. And that's one of the things we are looking at is with less demand and flow going into central London, we are looking at that issue about redistributing supply to outer London in particular. And we're looking at that particularly ahead of the schools reopening in September, because we know, I think there's around 66 priority secondary schools where we know that, well, we're fairly confident there's going to be a problem on the bus network, and that's where we need additional supply. So we're using that data and analysis to reallocate and redistribute supply to the areas that need it. Okay.
That's great. So I have Will who'd like to come back. Keith wanted to come in, and then I just want to check that Navin doesn't have anything else at the end.
Alison, I just wanted to pick up just on Navin's point around this sort of journeys in from outer London into central London and the challenges associated with that. And I'm going to say a couple of things. One is, I think, Nicole's right around the sort of importance of those local journeys. There's obviously the stuff that we've talked about in terms of staggering start times. Some people will continue to work from home, about people wearing masks, their own personal behaviour on the transport system. But I just want to say, just how much TfL, they've introduced a huge number of measures to keep passengers safe, from the hospital grade disinfectant, which protects places up to 30 days, the constant cleaning, which, the fact that the Banksy was cleaned off a tube carriage before anyone knew it was there just shows how effective, in a slightly tongue-in-cheek approach, just how quickly things are getting cleaned before anyone realizes it. So credit to the cleaners and all the people who are doing that hard work. The one-way systems in tube stations, I hope, will help. The hand sanitizers, all of that, there's a massive amount to make people feel safe. But the buses do have a key role to play in this. And part of that is keeping the bus drivers safe themselves. So the new screens should help with that in terms of the protecting them. But also we are extending the bus lane hours to make those journey times more reliable, so people will spend less time on those journeys coming in or going on to orbital and radial routes in central London. Once people get into central London, there's also the point around crowded transport hubs. So if you go to London Bridge, a station that gets hundreds of thousands of people coming in, and you can see them streaming across on a normal day across London Bridge into the city. You know, what we've been doing through the Streetspace program, which I know we'll come on to, is creating more space so that if there is, to reduce the waiting times within the station, we've got space allocated for people to actually create, to reduce the crowding within the station by taking space on the street space. So all of these measures come together, I hope, do provide some reassurance that it is, you know, that huge amount that TfL is doing to make it as safe and convenient and as fast for people to use that public transport system if they can't walk and cycle.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Nicole. Would you agree, Nicole, that if someone was travelling from outer London to inner London on a motorcycle, that would reduce the demand on other public transport?
I guess yes, in principle. I think the thing to bear in mind, though, always is that the thing that is of scarcity in London is obviously road space, and a motorcycle will still take up more road space than a bike, and more road space than if you were in a bus in normal crowded conditions. Obviously not at the moment. So it is always.
That's the point, Nicole. We're talking about at the moment. So at the moment, you know, a motorcycle will take up less road space than a car, obviously. Arguable whether it would take up more or less road space than a bus, but it would also free up space on that public transport, albeit a bus, a train, a tube, for someone else who wasn't able to ride a motorcycle. Would you not agree that?
Yeah, but I feel like you want that question to go somewhere else. I mean, yeah, sure, it gets someone off the public transport.
Well, it doesn't matter where the question's going. Okay.
I think the point with this one, Assembly Member Prince, is that there are relative decisions to be made, and you're absolutely right. I'm going to wind this up in a few minutes, so if you press on.
I just asked a question of Alex. It's based on that, and it'd be a very quick question.
Of course, so, no problem at all.
Thank you very much, Alison. Appreciate that. Will, the question is, you know, motorcycles don't take up any real road space. They move around. They've never been seen as an issue of congestion, and we know that modal shift to motorcycle actually reduces congestion. So the question is, I cannot understand at this moment in time, and only for this moment of time I'm asking, why we can't allow all motorcycles to travel into London without paying the ULEZ charge. I just can't understand it. It would free up space on public transport. It would free up space on the roads. Clearly, from a COVID perspective, you cannot get more protected from COVID than being a motorcyclist, frankly. I don't see why there cannot be an exception at this moment in time on the ULEZ, just for now, because
So motorcycles are exempt from the congestion charge, and the congestion charge, by its nature and its name, is to reduce congestion. So obviously they are not, they can come into the congestion charge zone. But the ULEZ is obviously not to do with congestion. That's an ultra low emissions piece, which is an air quality measure, and that's why we have that measure in addition to the congestion charge piece. And I think the very last thing any of us want at the moment, where we've got a respiratory pandemic, is that we want to have bad air quality. We're seeing increasing levels of evidence coming through from around the world that poor air quality is a contributor to the seriousness of COVID. So the last thing I want to do at the moment is relax our air quality conditions within any part of London as part of a response to this. So within congestion, the motorcycles are exempt from the congestion charge. Because you know, recognizing your point, but it's a separate issue around the ULEZ, which is a specific policy and program that is tackling air quality rather than congestion.
Okay, I'm not going to prolong this. I appreciate your time, Chairman. All I'm going to say is leave you with this, Will. It was not the Mayor's choice to reintroduce the ULEZ or the congestion charge. It was not the Mayor's choice to ban motorcycles during this phase because of air quality. He was forced to do that, and had it not been for the government to insist that that was reintroduced, those motorcycles would currently be allowed to travel inside London. So I think your answer, with all the greatest respect, is a bit ingenuous, because the Mayor has the opportunity to do what he wanted to do, which was to allow vehicles in at this time, but he was stopped from doing that by the government.
Okay.
Can I add something, Keith? What I'll do after this meeting is I'll dig out the numbers on the compliance levels for motorcycles in the ULEZ scheme.
96%.
Yeah, well, that was the figure in my head, but we track it every month, so I'll dig out the latest data for you and send it over. So my point really is that motorcycles have got the highest level of compliance of any vehicle entering the ULEZ scheme. So I think you just need to think about what is the value of giving an exemption to the kind of that 3% that are not already compliant. They've got the lowest standard. I think it's Euro 3, isn't it, for motorcycles?
Correct.
And it's actually a very small number of vehicles that have to pay it, and very few actually do pay it because that's the other thing.
That's the point. But Chair, I'm really grateful to you. I'll stop there. I could go on. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. We are running slightly behind already, so I think that's very helpful. But thank you for answering those questions. And we now move on to a section on the 3R framework and the London Streetspace programme. And I'm going to kick off with the first question, if I may. And it's broadly to Will and Alex, but Julian and Nicole may, of course, wish to comment. And I'm going to take this, it's quite a long question because I'd like you to pick all of them up together. And it's around what has been the level of compliance on car-free roads in central London, and with a particular focus on how they're being enforced, what impact these schemes have had on levels of walking and cycling, if it's not too early to tell, and what have been the effects on traffic flow, road safety and cycling and walking rates on other street space schemes implemented to date. So how are the car-free roads being implemented, and what's their impact, and what's the effect on the traffic flow of other street space schemes?
I'll have a go at answering that. So obviously the Streetspace programme was brought in as a sort of rapid temporary measure for creating more space so that to enable more people to walk and cycle. We've heard about the constraints on the public transport network in terms of capacity, and if a fraction of those sort of journeys that are formerly made by public transport all end up by cars, the city's going to gridlock. That's not good for anyone's economy, for our economy. That's not good for our air quality. It's not good for road danger. But the Streetspace programme isn't just about car-free streets. There are three sort of aspects to it. One of them are the temporary cycle lanes on main roads. So Park Lane's a good example. Alex already mentioned that one. The second piece is making the pavements around high streets as well as around transport hubs, like I mentioned at London Bridge, sort of wider, to allow people to queue for shops or to socially distance while they're moving around. And the third piece, which is low traffic neighbourhoods, which is essentially reducing access or creating access free only, largely in residential areas. There's some in central London as well, which allow people to still be able to drive and access buildings, but stop through traffic and running, making it safer. The speed at which this is being delivered, at the moment, I think we've got 37 or 40 kilometres of cycleways that are, in the last 8 weeks, we've sort of been either completed or under construction. Within the boroughs, I think we're funding something like 400 school streets, 170 plus low traffic neighbourhoods, 66 cycle routes. I just want to pay tribute to TfL and the borough officers just on how fast that is happening, and the speed and the skill by which that is happening. I think at the moment, certainly my focus is on the delivery of this, and I know all the boroughs are focusing on the delivery of this to get that in. In terms of compliance, there's no data that I have that I'm aware of at this point, because the schemes are still going in at the moment. But in terms of enforcement, I can talk a bit about how some of those schemes are getting enforced. Now, some of them are physical barriers. So, for example, in Broadway Market in Hackney, there are hostile vehicle mitigation barriers that were used for a market on a weekly basis, and those are now being used on a permanent basis to close that road still allows access to those businesses, but it closes it through traffic. Now that's an example where enforcement is a physical barrier. You're also seeing planters in many parts of London which are sort of physically blocking roads to motor traffic. We also have a system of fixed and mobile cameras using automatic number plate recognition. Now, these are important when you're filtering roads. That enforcement is being done by either fixed cameras, which we'll all be aware of, that takes a number plate, but they're also, the boroughs have these sort of cars that look like they've got sort of various different gadgets on the sort of their roof and things that pop out, and those are tackling the can move around between these different filters in a sort of random way to allow that enforcement. It's too early to get data off that at the moment. I will ask for that data to be collected so that we will be able to share that in terms of the number of enforcement. But for example, I know some filters went in yesterday, for example, and we're too in the thick of the delivery at the moment to fully understand what level of compliance is happening. There is also obviously the usual policing activities and the street enforcement activities that are being delivered both by the boroughs and by the boroughs as well as the stuff that's on the Transport for London Road Network, the TLRN, which is TfL. So I hope that sort of addresses a bit on the compliance. This was the third point around, the impact that it's having on traffic levels and traffic levels and pedestrian walking, that sort of thing. So what we are seeing is that the traffic during lockdown, traffic levels fell really considerably across the board, and what we saw were a huge number of cyclists and people out enjoying cycling. That's been the number of cyclists has been sustained. We've seen the cycling levels being massively up, and this doesn't come as a great surprise, because where we've installed cycle lanes in the past, we've seen more people using it. Where we've installed low traffic neighbourhoods in the past, we've seen people using it. So, we've seen over the weekend between 2 and 3 times as much cycling over the weekend. We saw a drop in weekday cycling at the early stage of the lockdown, which one would expect because most people were working from home and therefore weren't commuting. Amazingly, despite the sort of lower numbers of journeys, weekday cycling is back up to its normal levels, despite most people continuing to work at home, as we've heard about the lockdown. So overall, we've seen a huge increase in cycling. This is also being reported through the private sector in terms of I think I was talking to the chief exec of Halfords, who's seen a huge increase in demand across the board. Brompton have seen a 5-fold increase in their sales since April. Another bike shop, I spoke to someone who lives in Waltham Forest who's saying that there's a 6-week waiting list to get bikes at the moment in bike shops in Waltham Forest. So I've been talking to the bike industry about how we can get more bikes into London because of the priority of this. So we have seen that shift. Traffic, on the other hand, is beginning to return. So traffic on the Transport for London Road Network, I think on Friday was about only 7% down and we're seeing in central London it's still about 30% down, whereas inner and outer London that's sort of 15-10%. It varies a bit between the days. So we are seeing more people using the roads, but we are seeing really significant uptake in the amount of cycling. And where we are putting in the infrastructure, we are seeing, as we have done for the last 4 years, we're seeing increased numbers when there is safe infrastructure. Sorry, I think there were quite a lot of bit clauses. Does that answer all your question, Alison?
I think that covers pretty much everything. I just thought it was helpful to roll much of it together. And I don't know whether I'd like to move on, but if anybody else has any comment on that, I don't know whether Julian has anything to comment on that at the moment.
Sorry, my mute button took a long time.
Sorry, I should have reminded you.
Yeah, just to re-emphasise what Will said about being in the delivery stage. This is an enormous effort from the boroughs to do this in such a short window. And obviously, I think it's a short window in actual time, but there's also a short window in people's memories of all the benefits of lockdown in terms of the not only the lack of cars and the congestion, but what translated into improved air quality. Across our borough, we had a 25% reduction in nitrogen dioxide levels, and I think we've got to kind of hold on to that, and because there's certainly pushback from many people about some of the low traffic neighbourhoods, and I guess we'll get on to that in a minute, but it requires some political leadership to do it.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Now, I think Sean Bailey indicated that he wanted to come in. I would like to move on to Tony Devonish's question, but Sean, if you've got something burning to say, please do.
No, Chair, you keep going. I don't want to slow you down too much. You keep going.
Okay, no problem. So we now have two questions. Thank you very much, both of you, for that that full response to the question. Tony, we've got Tony Devonish has got two questions, but if you'd pause, I'll pause you after your first question, Assemblymember Devonish, so that somebody who wanted to come in had indicated they wanted to follow up on one of those.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My first question is to Will and Alex, and good morning.
Morning.
What are you doing to ensure that the introduction of the low traffic neighbourhoods is not moving the congestion and pollution into nearby roads? And this is a great question, because when I first became a councillor 15 years ago, my director of transportation, who you all remember, is now retired, Martin Lowe, used to always say, transport and traffic is like water. If you push it one way, it may not go the way you want it, but it will end up somewhere.
Thanks, Tony. So the low traffic neighbourhoods, I think, is a relatively new concept in London. We have been rolling them out prior to this, but the idea is to basically look at a traffic cell, so sort of areas which are surrounded by main roads, and looking at how can we reduce the traffic that flows through it. It still allows people to drive to their homes, get deliveries, get rubbish picked up from emergency services to get in, but it's about reducing the movement through that, and so preserving some of what Julian alluded to in terms of the benefits of during lockdown. When we saw lower traffic in neighbourhoods, we saw kids being able to safely go to the parks, we saw people being able to run, be able to walk, but crucially, and it goes back to something that was mentioned earlier, this idea of localisation, how do we get that local high streets back and those local journeys? So the low traffic neighbourhood isn't about shifting car journeys onto other roads. By opening up those streets to enable people to rethink how they're moving around with a focus on walking and cycling, it's about trying to shift those journeys from the cars to other modes of transport. And I think, all respect to Martin, who is now retired, there's a really great study that was done on low traffic neighbourhoods on a global level, which I think took in about 70 different case studies from 11 different I think it was 10 or 11, maybe Nicole knows this better than me, the Cairn study, but about 10, 11, 12 different countries. And what it shows is that traffic doesn't behave like water. It doesn't just flow through pipes finding the easiest parts. It's actually part of human choice, I suppose. And people make those different decisions. So what that showed is that within half of the case studies, there was a 11, 12, 13% reduction on the number of vehicles in the whole area was reduced, including the main roads. So the research globally certainly showed that low traffic neighbourhoods don't just shift shift traffic to one place to another. It does to a degree, and it is about putting some of the traffic onto those main roads, where I think most of us would agree it should be, rather than cutting through residential neighbourhoods and moving through those areas. So that was the international evidence. We have been delivering, as I said, some low traffic neighbourhoods elsewhere in London. So, everybody says, well, London's different. Well, actually, when we look at some of the low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest, you've seen a reduction of traffic by 90% in some places. Across the whole area, 56% reduction of traffic on those roads. And while there's been some increase on the main roads, they haven't taken all of that traffic displaced. I think something like 30-odd% has just been reduced. And why that has happened, and what's so encouraging about this approach, is that there's been a really significant behaviour change associated with the redesign of those roads. So just 1 year after some of the implementation of those low traffic neighbourhoods in Waltham Forest, we've seen increases of people walking by 32 minutes, I think cycling on average 32 minutes per week, which bucks the entire national trend of falling levels of physical activity. And Tony, you'll know the Prime Minister holds this, when I was in number 10 last week, talking about this, the importance of maintaining people's health, coming out of this public health crisis without sowing the seeds to the next one is so important. And tackling physical activity, tackling air quality, enabling more people to be more active and being more active in their everyday lives, not just runs and leisure activities, is absolutely essential for building the resilience of our city, but continuing to build that health benefits as well as the transport benefits with it. So, as I said, we are in the thick of a delivery at the moment. We're delivering at such speed. I'll agree, not everything is going to be done, it's going to be a great success. When you're delivering at this speed, the way I've been talking about it is we need to learn fast. If we're going to fail, we need to fail fast and we need to adapt it. Some of the schemes have already been adapted to monitor that. But we need to also judge a transport change, not immediately, one day after it's gone in or 1 week after it's gone out. Let it bed in a bit and let, as I said, that human decision-making, rather than water flowing through the pipes, it needs to adapt. So what we're doing with all of these schemes is monitoring and adapting them. They are all temporary schemes. They're being done under the statutory powers that the government have provided all highway authorities in the country to deliver these temporary schemes. And obviously, if communities agree with them, we'll engage them through consultation. But obviously, there might well be needing to be tweaks, changes, improvements, and what have you to learn from if some of those become permanent in the future.
Thank you. Can I just ask one very quick follow-up question, and yeah. I'll let Assembly Member Curtin come in. Thank you for that. We don't disagree on the principle. I think it is about the implementation. But can I just get you to agree that you touched on its temporary nature, that there will be full public consultations if and when you decide these are going to become permanent, with a decent timescale for people to genuinely be consulted, not it's stuck on page 64 the TfL site for 3 or 4 days, but they're proper quality public consultations.
Yeah, so as I said, the way that we're delivering this is at the moment through the statutory guidance that we've had from the Department for Transport, and we're working exceptionally closely both with DFT and Number 10 on this, and I think we all share the same goals on this. It's one of the areas I don't think that, I think we'll all be aware the Mayor and the Prime Minister don't always see eye to eye on everything, but this is something where everybody has a shared goal and a shared outcome in terms of getting more people walking, more people cycling. You're right, as we go, these are temporary measures. If we move to permanent, we will have to be looking at how we do that, how we engage communities. One of the things that we're developing at the moment, and Alex's team is working on this, is an online map so that people can comment on these things as they experience them. It will be a slightly different way of doing a normal public consultation, which is sort of producing some drawings and some sort of abstracts and then saying, well, this is what's going to happen. Now, actually, in some cases, we'll have some of these schemes, and what do you think? What might need to be improved? One of the things I'm insisting on is that no one outside maybe these four walls or these 4 sides of my screen will actually know what a TfL road is and what a borough road is. Who knows that? I didn't before I did this job. So we kind of need to have all of this on one shared map so that it isn't just going, oh, well, this is on a TfL website, this is on a borough website, and heaven's sake, where does Ealing stop and Hounslow start? I know Julian will be able to tell me this, but I think most people in real life don't know this. And so trying to think in a different a way, not coming back from the quality of the consultation, but the way we consult and engage, so it is more accessible, more user-friendly, and people can contribute to this, I think is going to be a really important part of how we go forward. So there's sort of almost 2 strands of work going on at the moment. There's this delivery focus, and every one of my team will know all I'm banging on is about delivery, but it's also about monitoring, engagement, and then understanding, tweaking, and changing.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. Well, I just want to put to you a couple of cases where the low traffic neighbourhoods seem to have gone wrong because of feedback I've been getting from taxi drivers and other people, businessmen, businesswomen. One is in the area where TfL is putting in cycle lanes on Euston Road. So that's narrowing the road space for other vehicles. And that's next door to some of these low neighbourhood schemes which have been putting in by the local councils. Camden Council, for example, I think have blocked off one of the entrances from south, the neighbourhood south of Euston Road, onto Euston Road itself. And, you know, I'm hearing there's immense amounts of congestion in the Euston Road area. Simply because you've got two things happening at the same time. TfL are doing something to reduce road space, and then Camden Council are doing something to reduce access to the same road space. This is something that isn't working. What can you do, or what will you do to rectify the situation around Euston Road?
So the Euston Road is only. I come back to what one of the points I made earlier, David, is that we need, you know, but all respect to Martin and Tony's former colleague, you know, the evidence shows that traffic isn't like water. There's human decision here. And I think we need to let some of these schemes bed in a little bit and understand it. There's a full monitoring and evaluation sort of process going in on some of these bigger schemes like Euston Road, so we can manage to change that if and when we need to. I do think, you know, there seems to, I like you, I get a lot of correspondence from various different people. I think I get a balance of people who really like some of this stuff and really object to some of this stuff. And I imagine all of you as Assembly members get similar sort of levels of correspondence. Some of the sort of more, certainly some of them, you get irate correspondence on both sides, of both ends of the spectrum. And I'm sure you'll all be aware of that. But I know some of the sort of, there's a lot of concerns, you know, Euston's only just gone in, but Park Lane, for example, has been in for a bit longer, where I've got a lot of things saying, oh, there's gridlock now, or it's putting out. Actually, I did ask TfL to look at what the timings are for journeys, and I think the journeys on Park Lane are only 40 seconds longer on average than on that section. But actually, as part of a longer journey, from Vauxhall Bridge to Marble Arch, for example, along Park Lane takes exactly the same time as it did pre-lockdown. So it is you know, let's let these bed in. If there are problems with them, we are monitoring it, and we can change them. As we said, they're temporary. But I do want to give these enough time to bed in so that people can adapt to them.
Well, you're sort of comparing two different things there that might be different, because traffic pre-lockdown is much greater in general, in total, than now. So if the traffic levels in the whole of London get back up to pre-lockdown levels, I mean, I think that the congestion on Park Lane, as you say, is not going to be 40 seconds longer. It's going to be an awful lot longer than that. But I mean, that wasn't what I wanted to ask you about. You might want to come back on that. But the other thing I did want to ask, the second thing, the last thing, is, again, I'm getting a lot of correspondence from people living in some of the inner London boroughs, like Tower Hamlets, like Islington, like Hackney, where it's not just car users that are being affected. You know, I understand you want people to get out of private cars and walk and cycle, but it's business owners who have to make deliveries, it's emergency vehicles, it's taxis who need to go to places and pick up and drop off disabled people. And they don't have some of the access that they would do. I mean, so you've really got to think about those people. I mean, what would you say to business owners who perhaps do a business in one of these new low traffic neighborhoods, and then find, because they've only got one way out of the neighborhood, you know, 2 or 3 of their access points have been cut off, that their delivery times are taking a lot longer, and that's actually affecting their business. I mean, when that happens, what will you do to actually, you know, rectify the situation so that businesses don't suffer, for example?
I've come back to two things on that. One is that we the way that the low traffic neighbourhoods are designed is not to prevent access. It might restrict access into some areas and change some of the way that people get around in that. But it certainly isn't to stop access. We're working very closely with the emergency services, and that's why we're bringing in some of the cameras approach to enforcement, rather than just blocking off all the streets using bollards, so that does enable the emergency services to go through. In terms of businesses specifically, I would say 2 things. One is that I've been talking to freight organisations and other businesses through the business improvement districts and understanding this. And I know that they share my concern, is that it's not just that traffic might go back to pre-lockdown levels, which I want to avoid. My worry is it goes back to far more than that. And if we get that shift of journeys to people who were previously using public transport to private cars, we've seen this in Asian cities as they come out of COVID. If that happens, it's going to be bad for everybody, the deliveries and the freight, the essential freight and those essential journeys that keep London thriving is going to get stuck in gridlock. And we're seeing this in other cities. That's why we're trying to enable as many of those people who can walk and cycle to walk and cycle for their journeys, to free up the space on the roads and on the public transport system to use those if they can't. So I know, I'm not a fanatic. I know not every journey can be walked or cycled. You know, you do need to have deliveries. You do need to. Many people can't do that. But we need to make as many of those people who can do those journeys as possible to do that, because the last thing businesses I've spoken to want is gridlock or air quality problems that put people off coming into the central London or worry about that. The third point is that learning again from low traffic neighbourhoods that we already have, where we have delivered these things, what we've seen for businesses is an increase in footfall in their shops, an increase in spend in their shops. So, and where we've done these studies, and these are not done by me or TfL, actually, they're done by university. And I know Nicole could probably comment far better than I. She's far better qualified than me on this stuff. But we've seen 40% more spend, or 40% more footfall, 30% more spend, if I remember my figures correctly. So while there's obviously a lot of people are anxious around change, and change on the transport system always creates a very emotive approach, what we have seen once these things people get used to them is actually this is good for business. This is good for business by preventing lockdown, but it's also good for business in terms of encouraging footfall and spend on the high street, which is, I think, something we all need to be seeing as we come out of this crisis and the perils of the economic sort of dark clouds that are looming for everyone in London.
Well, with respect, Will, I don't have too much time to go. I know we've got to move on, but I do wonder, you know, the studies you talk about businesses having increased footfall and increased spending in their shops. That's not what I'm hearing from some of the people who have to do deliveries, and their sort of access is blocked off in some of these low traffic neighbourhoods. But yeah, I think
I'm really happy to share the data, because I know every study that has been done either here or abroad has shown that same pattern. So I'm really happy to share some of that with you, David, if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be good. I mean, but also, you know, it maybe that was data from before the lockdown, before the COVID-19 situation, and so what's happening now might be different. So, but it would be good if you could send that to me so I could have a look. Thank you.
Assemblymember Kane, I think we've had an undertaking that they'll come back with data, and I think actually there'll be an opportunity for it later in the year to look at this perhaps in more detail, and because it would be really interesting to understand how it has played out. But things will take a bit of time to bed in. I think there are lots of opportunities here, but it will be really interesting to hear how that plays out. For example, we're getting more deliveries through online purchasing, and that's a dynamic that I'm sure will be feeding into all of this as we go forward. Assemblymember Devenish, if you'd like to pick up your second question, and then we can keep things moving forward. But thank you.
Chair, just before I do, I'd like to echo David's point. I'm out in central London every night in main restaurant areas, and Will, what I do find, I totally agree with your positive attitude for modal shift, but I do have to make a plea for my older residents, because what I am noticing is the 30 and 40 something year old, dare I say it, white architect cyclists who are out socialising in central London, and not my older residents. That may be in part because they're still worried about the whole COVID thing, but I am concerned that they also feel, and I'm getting an awful lot of postbag at the moment on this, they don't feel they can drive to their normal restaurant, take their grandchild out, and I am concerned about their social isolation. So any information you've got when you share the data in terms of older demographics, I'd be really interested in, please. On to my actual question, and thank you, Chair, for giving me the time. How are you, or should the needs of Londoners for whom cycling and walking may be currently impractical, being factored into TfL's remote plans, please?
So, Tony, I do agree with you on the older people and the worries around isolation. I was in Soho briefly. I've cycled through part of that, and it was wonderful seeing some of the streets had actually been closed off and turned over to that restaurant trade, and you could see people coming back. Now, I know this is the first week of it. I think people are apprehensive about returning to some of that, but I hope that by turning over some of that space to those restaurants and allowing more social distancing, in those spaces will help restore confidence in this. Not everybody is going to come back at the same time, and I think that certain demographics might feel more confident faster, and some demographics are maybe less at risk than others. But I hope that there'd be the sort of some of those groups that we saw out and about this weekend will be the sort of pioneers to do this in a safe way and restore that. In terms of people who can't walk and cycle, I said it earlier on. I know that not every journey can be walked and cycled. I'm not a fanatic on this. But I'm always amazed how many journeys can be walked and cycled. So just in terms of those journeys. So this is about enabling those people who can walk and cycle to walk and cycle, and then freeing up space on the roads and on the public transport system, as I've said, so that those are people who can't do it do actually have that space and are able to do that. In terms of, we are doing our utmost to make sure the changes that we are doing are as inclusive as possible. Part of this, one of the things older people mentioned to me, that actually queuing at traffic lights, for example, where is a problem, where you've got busy pavements and people don't feel confident in terms of, and don't have the mobility to move quickly across the traffic lights. So one of the things we have been doing is reviewing all the traffic light signals. I think over 1,000 traffic lights have been reviewed in central London to allow more time for people to cross the road, more green time and less queuing time on pavements, for example. We're doing our utmost, and if you pop down to Brixton, it's a good example of where the increased space around the bus stops and there have actually been done in a way that will allow people with disability or mobility challenges, or people with young people, to access that new space. We're doing our utmost, and including some of the tactile needs for people with visual impairments. I think some of the stuff, quite frankly, that's been rolled out very quickly is not up to scratch, and that's why we're going back to review some of that so that it is as accessible as possible. And I think then there's also this issue of how do we make sure that as we move forward in this, and if any of these measures do become permanent, they are going through the full engagement, as we talked about earlier, and are out there, because I don't want London's recovery to be for the few. London's recovery has to be for all of us, because that's the city we all love and embrace. So the measures we are doing is trying to repurpose and reprioritize space so that everybody benefits from this. It isn't just focused on one particular demographic, but if we can get as many people walking and cycling as possible, and that the idea is that then frees up space for those people who can't.
Thank you. My final question, specifically, what approaches should be taken for those in outer London that need to travel into the central zone for work or travel on longer orbital routes? And again, I'm getting a huge amount of faith group people who live in the outer, live where my friend Keith Prince lives, come into their church in Westminster, and they don't feel they can at the moment with all these additional measures. So could you answer that, please? And I'll stop there and hand back to the chair.
I think we touched on this a bit when we were talking to Navin earlier, in terms of how we can get people in from outer London into central London. I think part of this again is, I don't want to rehash everything I've said, but it's certainly around how we spread the peak and how we stagger start times. Part of this is how Londoners and urging Londoners to avoid those busy times and wear a mask for those journeys. I think part of this is about the range of measures that TfL have introduced to keep passengers safe on the public transport system, from the disinfectant, like I said, one-way systems, the hand sanitizer points and that side of things. Part of it is about, the improvements we're trying to make to the bus network by expanding those bus hours so that those become more normal. So, And as I said, I think making the space for people to be able to walk and move around central London is absolutely key. I look at some of the medieval sort of street layouts in the city, and one of my big fears there is if you're walking along there and you step out to avoid coming into close contact with someone on those busy pavements, you could end up stepping into a busy road. So that's why some of the work that we're doing to try and create more pedestrian space in central London is absolutely essential to make sure that people do come back. And talking to employers in central London, they're very supportive of this and would like to see more of it, because they need their employees to feel safe. And I think from London more generally, for London to maintain its international competitive advantage. Why do people like coming to London? You know, why do people invest in London? It's because of the workforce and the people who work in London. The utmost priority in employers that I speak to at the moment is the safety of their workforce. If they don't feel safe to come into the office, they won't. So will investment decisions be made of relocating elsewhere? So that is why it's so important that we have got this ambitious plan to make our streets safer, so that people do feel safe coming back into the centre, coming back into workplaces, and London continues to thrive as a global city.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And if I might just, before as we move on to the next question, just make a plea for orbital routes in Outer London as well, because as we're supporting our town centres to come back economically as well, I think that's an important area. I'd now like to ask Assembly Member Russell to ask the first of three questions that she has, and she should be able to proceed through all of those three together. Assembly Member Russell.
Chair. Yes, so we've got TfL now operating under an emergency budget, and you've had to pause or cancel everything you can to balance the budget, including a lot of the Healthy Streets projects. But there has been 45 million to allocate to the boroughs, which I understand is fully allocated. So my question is, how has TfL prioritised the Streetspace projects, and are the boroughs with better existing provision for walking and cycling, for example, being given greater support because they're in a better position to deliver? So that's a question for Will to start with, but I'd also be very interested to hear what Julian has to say on it.
So you're right. Due to the fact that the tube was running throughout this whole process, and our whole network was running for key workers during lockdown, the fact that we had a 90-odd% fall in revenue on this, there was the need for the government support. As part of that, for this first tranche, for this first up until the end of September, the existing Healthy Streets schemes, most of them were put on pause, and that's why the Streetspace programme has come in. You're right in saying that the total amount of funding as part of the TfL package was £55 million. Now that was 10 million for TfL and 45 million for boroughs. There was an additional 25 million that was allocated to London through the Department for Transport, of which 5 million has been allocated. And another 20 million is in the process of being looked at the moment. The 45 million pounds is not enough. I don't think I think that we had over 100, I think just under 100 million pounds worth of proposals for schemes as part of from boroughs. Wonderful to see that level of ambition and priority coming from colleagues across London. But of the 45 million, there was 30, we wanted to cover the sunk costs from schemes that had already been either committed to, contracts that had already been fulfilled, and crucially, staff costs in boroughs. Because the last thing we need is during this period to hollow out London's capacity and the skills of all those borough officers. So of that 45 million, about 14 million of that was for those sunk costs and staff contributions to keep that going. 30 million went to the Streetspace plans. There is obviously the extra 25 million from DFT, and that's now being done jointly with TfL. So we have a regular meeting, a weekly meeting of what is now called the Active Travel Oversight Group, I think it is. I always forget these acronyms. They seem to TfL thrive off acronyms, and I kind of need a glossary as part of my daily life. But it's that, which includes TfL, myself, number 10, as well as the Department for Transport. And what we're doing with the additional the Department for Transport money is coordinating that through that group. So the last thing I want is more boroughs to have to create more. We don't want to create more work for boroughs where they've already submitted some very good schemes. We just haven't got the budget to fund it all. So that process will be done, so coordinating through the existing framework and hopefully allocating funds to some of those projects that didn't get funding in the first phase. In terms of how we are prioritising it, as I said, there's been a massive there's much more need for this than there is supply of finance. And so what we have done, but that said, I do want to say just the scale of what is being delivered, or with the amount that's being delivered. I think we're funding over 600 different schemes in the boroughs. As I said, the number of livable neighbourhoods, the number of 400 school streets, the 66 plus cycle routes. I think in the next 4 months, we're probably going to deliver more cycle routes than the previous mayoral administration in both terms in 4 months. So just the scale of what's happening is truly astonishing. So I think we're getting bang for buck. But we are having to prioritise where that investment goes. And so there are a number of things we've been looking at is doing, as you know, I've based a lot of what we're doing on strategic cycle analysis and a walking analysis, which has shown where there are priority needs. We did a very we rapidly redid those for sort of emergency measures, identifying hotspots. Alison picked up on some of the radial routes. How do we get to town centres? But also understanding where the busiest, most crowded pavements are. But, I don't want to say that TfL computers, no offence to Alex, TfL computers can't decide all of this. The boroughs have so much great knowledge from either their brilliant officers or communities themselves. Yeah. So that's why working really closely with them has led to a lot of these schemes coming in. There have been the way that we've asked, we selected the bids that came in, and we'll continue to use this approach, is can these things be delivered? Are they good quality? And we have to meet the quality designs. We can't waste money on stuff that isn't good enough. Is it good value for money? This is public. Even though there's less money of it, it's still public money, and we need to get good value. And I'm totally convinced we're getting good value on it, just because of the enormity of what we're actually being able to deliver with a very small amount of money. But we've also got to factor in, can this be delivered within the agreed timescales? Because these are emergency temporary measures that will be being delivered up until the autumn. So is it actually feasible? And do we all agree that these are feasible to be delivered that way? And then there are clearly, while the whole world has changed due to COVID, the physics of the world hasn't changed. There's still limited amount of space. There's still a lot of the same problems that we've had in delivering anything at any point over the last 4 years. Those things still exist. We still need to balance bus passengers, as I said, and other modes and freight and everything else. So, there's also got to be looking at, well, what impact does this have on the broader network? So the prioritisation is being done through those lenses. Sorry, I've just gone off on one, and I hope I've covered a lot of what you asked. And then the final piece on this is that a cycle route from nowhere to nowhere doesn't really lead to some of the changes that we want to see. Part of this is also looking at what's the existing cycle network and how can we fill in some of the blanks, join up existing routes, improve some of the routes. So if you go down to, Cycle Superhighway 8, for example, that was delivered, it was one of the very first cycle routes delivered way before my time. It's essentially a bit of blue paint on a road. That now has been improved to actually enable people who may be less confident in cycling to start cycling, because it's now got physical separation. Similarly, there are upgrades to Cycleway 5 through Lambeth, where maybe it wasn't meeting quality criteria in the right places. Similarly, Cycle Superhighway 7 from Collier's Wood up to Balham is an upgrade of existing routes. So we've got to take in the lens of how do we improve this, how do we improve that network, and how do we get the greatest bang for the buck in terms of the greatest potential for people to use this infrastructure.
Thank you. That was massively comprehensive and really very, very useful. The one question that comes from what you've just said is, what about those boroughs that aren't coming forward with the programmes that deliver the good value for money, that are able to be delivered and that deliver that quality of standard that provides a proper network? Is there anything being done to help those boroughs to produce better bids? I mean, has every borough had some money, or are there boroughs that are really struggling to get bids together that will deliver in the way that you need them to deliver at the moment?
So we have this is obviously some boroughs, the range of reasons why some boroughs are very good at delivering, and others partly political will, partly the capacity of officers, partly the sort of history of the area, partly the nature of the area and the nature of the populations and the nature of the demographics and the nature of the physical environments they've got to operate in. I think every borough now has received something in terms of this programme. One of the things that we did do is when some bids came in which didn't meet any quality criteria that we had or weren't achieving those priorities, TfL officers have been working with those borough officers to say, well, actually, this hasn't really delivered it. Could you, if you maybe if you did X, Y, and Z, or this might be a way of looking at it. And I'm pleased to say that of 6 boroughs that we didn't initially make any allocations to, 5 of those 6 came back and did have significant improvements. So therefore, that will be continuing. These conversations are, this is, I can't, like the amount of work that's happening and the credit that both TfL teams and borough teams have in terms of communicating, building this is ongoing conversations. I know that, for example, within the bidding process, some boroughs got money for things that they maybe didn't want to prioritise, and it was difficult for us to know what was prioritised and what wasn't being prioritised when people don't, when that information necessarily isn't being communicated. So there are now bilateral conversations going on to make sure that that we can iron that out. There's also now a monitoring and sort of system to make sure that what is being delivered meets the quality and is being delivered in the way that the bids proposed. So yes, I hope that helps. Oh.
Sorry, the perils of still having a landline that no one ever rings. I imagine it's someone trying to scam me with something. Sorry, Julian, you were wanting to come in on that question about how the boroughs are feeling about what they're getting and how this is all working.
Yeah, so from my perspective, with my Ealing hat on, we were a borough that didn't get Mini Holland's funding. We just missed out, and that's been a kind of point of frustration for me. Wanting to go ahead and do these kind of schemes, but not having the resource to do it. So, when this came along, this seemed to be a fantastic opportunity to really push forward and get that funding that we hadn't had previously. Now, as Will said, there's been a massive oversubscription of asks from boroughs. We've pretty much got just over £1 million, but we've got schemes that would cost £3 million. So there's an awful lot more that we would want to do. I think there is a perception, and I didn't say this at the last Transport and Environment Committee, but others did, that some of the non-Mini Hollands boroughs were not getting as much as they had hoped, and that the Mini Hollands boroughs seemed to be getting a probably disproportionate whack of this round of funding. Now, there's always a chance to rectify this in the next 20 million that's going to come in the second round. So I understand that, certainly with Waltham Forest, they're the leaders. They've shown how this can be done. So there's confidence in their bids because they've been there, they've done it, they've shown the political will to do it. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of political leadership and political will on this. The reactions in terms of some of the low traffic neighbourhoods are quite politically challenging, and people need to show leadership and also hold their nerve in terms of going forward with this. But I certainly, talking to my other Transport and Environment Committee colleagues, they are determined to do this and to push forward with this. And as Will has said, there's a probably unlikely alliance between the Mayor and the Prime Minister on this one. Yeah, certainly I think non-Mini Hollands boroughs would appreciate a bit more in the next round.
Alison, would it be possible to quickly come back on just that and just give some reassurance on that?
Yes, that would be helpful.
Yes, I think that yeah, if you'd like to come back on that, and while you're doing that, can we also, we did ask actually at the last meeting, but is it possible to get the full minutes and papers for the active travel group? Because it really would be helpful in terms of our scrutiny. As you can understand, we're a group of committed enthusiasts on this, but it would be really helpful if we're able to have those.
On that one, I think I've said before that those minutes are available. I don't know if a request has come in. It certainly hasn't come to me, but I'm probably the worst person to ask. If you ask me, I'll pass it on to my team, and they'll be able to provide minutes from those meetings.
I'll do that.
On the Mini Holland piece, one of the things we did want to do was make sure that while quite a lot within this first phase of stuff that was already sort of in the pipeline to get delivered, which is, I think, why some of the schemes that were already being in development were thought, well, actually, this provides good value. It does provide the need. We can do it in a slightly different way, which I think is slightly why some of those boroughs got skewed. But other boroughs have done, very well. Sadly, I think I'm in a difficult position where everyone's going to be disappointed. There's £100 million worth of applications and £30 million to really give out, and everybody now dislikes me because not everybody got what they wanted. But I think the key point here is that there is obviously the next round of DFT money that is available, this 20 million, and we're working through that at the moment. The second piece is that I'm in very regular discussions with government on what happens next. So obviously the funding package that TfL had runs up until mid-October in terms of that support package. I think we all agree that this agenda is not going to, everybody, as I've said, as Julian said, this is a shared agenda. And so actually talking through what the nature of ongoing funding models and further work on this area is something that I'm certainly talking about and having regular conversations as part of those negotiations. And I think there is this alliance saying that actually this is a really key thing as part of London and the UK's recovery.
But just in terms of having the sufficient money, because obviously the whole sort of pipeline of schemes that you had lined up through Healthy Streets has been paused. Are you confident that, because at the moment you've had this first tranche of money, and then it sort of seems like you're sort of potentially working in a sort of 6 months and then maybe a year, and then kind of whatever on earth comes in the future after that. So it's good that you've got the alliance between what government wants and what the mayor wants, and that feels very constructive. But are you confident that you are going to know how much money you've got going forward? Because once this pot of money has run out, the current Streetspace allocations, it looks a bit empty going forwards.
Well, it is empty going forward. The whole TfL, the whole TfL funding is therefore, that's why the H1, as it's known, the first half, is covering this period. Obviously, we can't make commitments to what goes on in the future beyond that. We obviously have plans. There's an awful lot of stuff, as I said, on the books. We've recognised the key role that boroughs have in delivering this, but this is obviously subject to the negotiations with government. There's no other way of looking at this, really. It's, this is a priority for TfL, this is a priority for the mayor, this is a priority for the Prime Minister, it's a priority for the Secretary of State. I couldn't think of a better alignment where everybody's agreed with this. But in terms of absolute numbers, that has to be the subject of the negotiations and the final funding arrangement. But just to reassure you that the funding arrangement, we can't keep on operating on 6 months, 6 months by 6 months by 6 months. there's part of those discussions are, and as you'll be aware of the some announcements recently, is looking at, well, what is the future funding arrangements for transport in London, full stop, and this has to be part of those discussions.
Yes, and just given that you are living month to month at the moment and don't have that long-term sort of continuity and certainty about funding, what about with the dangerous junctions? Are you, because that programme has obviously halted, are you able to kind of put in temporary street space routes to avoid dangerous junctions or to sort of rectify them very quickly, sort of at lower cost, a bit like some of the temporary works that you've done at Old Street? Are there ways that you can use this more temporary street space approach to tackle some of those long-term issues of very dangerous junctions? Because otherwise, if we've got a sort of pop-up bike lane along a bit of a stretch of main road, but then it all falls apart at the junction, that doesn't help to build the network that you were talking about just earlier.
Yeah, so it's been amazing how ingenious people, engineers both in boroughs and in TfL have been in terms of using the temporary measures to address some of those safety concerns. But you're right, you can't do every junction, and there are routes that I've got planned. I can't do it all in temporary measures because, for example, putting in new traffic signals can't be done temporarily. That's got to be a permanent measure. So I think where, some of the discussions that I'm having at the moment are around this sort of idea of temporary plus, which is sort of continuing to use different materials, trying to do this stuff fast and providing very good value, but then looking at, well, where there is needed to be some permanent changes as part of the schemes that have been in the pipeline that have either been consulted on or will be consulted on. Can we use some of the, can we make some of those, use some permanent measures as part of that? So those are, that's not the same as the temporary schemes that's being rolled out. That's looking at some of the schemes that have been, been on the books or being designed up at the moment. So I think this is a, this is a real challenge, but in any challenge, there's a massive opportunity. And once again, just credit to the innovation and the skill sets of everybody across London who is actually delivering this in a really good way.
Thank you. And just finally, picking up on the mapping, because it's really important that Londoners can see this stuff and know how to use it. You talked about the consultation in future, having TfL and borough schemes all on a map together to be able to be consulted on. Is it possible to extend that borough and TfL routes onto the maps that that TfL has, the TfL journey planner? At the moment, for instance, the Uxbridge Road that's on Julian's screen behind him is not showing on the TfL journey planner. So is it possible to kind of get that borough and TfL road coming together on the TfL mapping systems?
It should be possible. It's taking a bit of time. When you've got 860 projects going on in boroughs, and I don't know how many projects going on, all within the matter of weeks. Literally, what's being delivered in days and weeks. Well, usually takes months and years being delivered in days and weeks. So we are, I think it's fair to say, we are playing catch up with some of the stuff that is going in, and IT systems tend to take a little bit longer to play catch up. This is a priority, and we're working very hard to try and get this right. Is not always perfect. Just on the consultations, we'll still have to carry out separate consultations because obviously the Highway Authority has to consult on it, in its own way. What I was talking about is the map for engagement that will be including both the TfL and the borough schemes, and I hope that will be up online soon, and I'll let you know when it is.
Thank you. And finally, if I could just echo what the chair said about the minutes of the Active Travel Oversight Group. At the moment, I'm still waiting for lots of answers on MQs about Streetspace. And a lot of what I've learned has come through from stuff that's actually been given to journalists. And we are the Assembly. We do need to be able to scrutinise what's going on. So if I could put in a plea for that information, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, certainly. I think we're all working exceptionally hard at the moment, and I really don't want stuff going out to journalists first. Everybody is working flat out at the moment, so we'll do our best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Russell, Assemblymember Russell, and I fully accept that there's a lot of staff are stretched and going flat out. It is helpful though to be able to have those. We are, I hope, critical friend partners in this. Okay, and we are moving on now to the next set of questions from Caroline, Assemblymember Pigeon. Now, this is a complicated set. We've got 2 questions, but we've got a series of follow-ups. So, Assemblymember Pigeon, if you could start on 7, and I know then I have Navin, Keith and David Curtin who want to come in, and then on 8, Caroline Russell and Sean want to follow up. Can I just put everybody on notice that time is getting away from us because this is a fascinating and brilliant discussion. So can we just try and rein ourselves in very slightly so that we can make sure we get through the agenda? Councillor Pigeon, Assemblymember Pigeon, sorry.
Absolutely, and just picking up from what Assemblymember Russell said, I think it would be really helpful in our follow-up correspondence if you could set out for us, Will, the full monitoring and evaluation that you're planning to put in place as schemes bed in, what level of scheme, what you would expect the boroughs to, because that's the sort of questions I'm getting from people. They're not sure about the temporary schemes that have come in. Some love them, as you say, some hate them. But actually, how are you going to make that decision, you and the boroughs? So I'm wondering if we could get some of that in writing, that would be really, really helpful. But my first question to you is what active measures, and this is to Will, maybe we'll start with Alex actually, Will's been talking a lot, give you a rest for a moment. What active measures has TfL implemented to ensure that Londoners with mobility issues and disabilities have access to the new pedestrianised areas of central London?
I can't go through specific schemes really because it does vary so much by each highway authority and locality. But certainly access for people with disabilities is a fundamental part of the scheme design and is something that we are responding to as we deliver some of these. Because certainly some of the earlier or the first round of town centre schemes where we widen pavements to create more space for social distancing, one of the issues there was that they were solid and continuous barriers that did often sometimes raise an accessibility issue. So one of the things we are looking at is actually amending the design to make them a bit more permeable to address those concerns that people had about how do people, once you're in it, it was fine, you were protected and felt safe, but often you couldn't get out of it until you got to the end of the road. So it was a kind of pointless process, really. So I think this is a kind of scheme by scheme consideration that TfL takes into account and the boroughs take into account. But I do think we are changing as we go, really. The other scheme, which I think, or the other area where there's a lot of changes in the City of London, and we're shortly to start work on a scheme in Bishopsgate, and I know that that's one of the issues there about how we reduce the amount of through traffic there, but also how we provide adequate access to there for taxi drivers and private hire vehicles as well, and often people who are carrying people with mobility issues, so that we make sure that they have access to that area, but not as a through route. So it is a kind of scheme by scheme consideration, but also I certainly think the first round of stuff we did didn't maybe address it in the way we should have done, and we've amended it really. So it's an evolving picture really. I'm not sure, Will, if there's anything else we need to say on that because I think
I'll bring Will in a sec. Could I just pick up, you've raised the issue around taxis, and obviously they are fully accessible, and for some disabled people, not all, but for some people with disabilities, they give them access to the city. So are you confirming that the access for taxis to help with people with mobility issues is always considered with each of these schemes that you're bringing in?
Yes, yeah, it is. I mean, the classic example is Bishopsgate, really, where the way we're looking at adapting that road is it will cease to be a through route for general traffic. It's a through route for buses and cyclists and pedestrians if they choose to do it. However, that is only at certain points on the road. So if a taxi is wishing to access the road to drop someone off or pick them up, they can continue to do that. So these kind of point interventions are a way of actually reducing the amount of general through traffic, but you still enable and provide access for taxis to get in there, because they clearly need to do that.
And will this be all black taxis, not just saying electric only, given the huge impact, everyone's had 6 months really. A lot of people haven't been able to work, and I've sort of have read and have raised this with the mayor, the issue that some drivers, because they don't have the new electric taxi and they can't afford the new electric taxi, particularly at the moment, will not have access to certain roads, which seems to me, given where we are, not a good move.
Well, the only taxi or ZEC only taxi restriction I'm aware of is Beach Street in the City of London, and that's something that they chose to do on their highway authority as a way of dealing with a very localised, difficult air quality problem. Because if you know Beach Street, that's in a tunnel when it's day, and it's got a lot of air quality concerns. I'm not close enough to the Bishopsgate scheme.
I am.
So okay. I think we're more based to answer that than me.
But generally, just before I bring Will in, that's not an issue. You're always making sure black taxis have access.
Yes, yeah, that's the kind of default, yeah.
Will, do you want to come in on that?
So a couple of things. On black taxis on Bishopsgate, that access will be for all black taxis, irrespective of not just the ZEC only. With all these things, we've got to keep this under review. I know I've spoken to David about this, I've spoken to Keith, I've spoken to taxi representatives. I recognise the challenges the trade face, and we certainly need the taxi trade as part of London. I want to keep it under review in terms of numbers. If you look at Oxford Street at the moment, for example, which is bus and taxi only, it's one of the most polluted streets in Europe. It's got a horrible number of, I think it's one fatality every year, and that has got restrictions. So we need to make sure that what we are delivering is and we can monitor the numbers to make sure it continues to be safe and contribute to the sort of various aims that we're getting. But that is the case. I just wanted to pick up, Alex was right. We're looking at this on a scheme by scheme basis. And as he said, doing stuff at this speed means we don't get everything right. And we are going back, and we're not proud enough. We're not proud. What am I trying to say? We are not proud. We are, if things are not right, we are tweaking them and changing them. There is guidance that we've been providing, both in terms of equalities, accessibility, security is a consideration, as well as inclusion on all of these schemes. I'll give you some examples just to illustrate quite why, why this is so important. If you put some of the schemes in terms of widening pavements, all looks good. You can put ramps in so people with mobility issues can use that. You can put in tactile pavements. But if you've got a bus stop, for example, the very last thing I want to do is to lose the sort of step-free access that most of our bus stops have to provide for people. So if you have a look at the temporary scheme on Brixton and in Park Lane, for example, we've gone to massive extent to try and keep that. We've widened the curb. It doesn't look temporary, but it is. If you look at it carefully, there are rubber, there's sort of rubber curbs, and asphalt has filled that space, but that continues to allow the bus ramps to go down to provide that step-free access at the critical points. And it's that level of detail in each and every scheme that needs to be considered. And I'm sorry we don't get it right at first at every time, but we are committed to continue to come back and work it. We are providing guidance. We are getting better at this, but this is a learning curve like I don't think any of us have been on. And I think, we need to both embrace the ambition and make sure we are doing everything we possibly can to make it accessible for all Londoners.
Yeah, no, absolutely understand it's unusual times we're in. I'll let others come in on this and then I'll move on.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. Assembly Member Prince, if you still want to ask a follow-up question, please do so now.
My point's been covered, Chair. My point's been covered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Assembly Member Curtin.
Mute, David, I think.
Mute, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Chair, but my point's been covered as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So, Assembly Member Pigeon, if we can move on to your next question.
Absolutely. The next one, perhaps we'll start with Julian on this one, and that is how are training needs for those that are new to cycling or those who've not cycled for many years being catered for to help ensure their safety?
So there are clearly social distancing issues around whether or not, how close a cycle instructor can get to somebody. So I think a brand new cyclist or wannabe cyclist who cannot cycle is not really possible at this point. You're closer than the 1 meter plus. Those who can cycle but have not done so for a while and are now pulling the bike out of the shed and doing the repairs, but really haven't got the confidence and need some kind of refresher and some road awareness training. That's really needed.
Yeah.
And previously a lot of our cycle training has gone into schools, and I think that still needs to happen, given we haven't talked about the under 18 free travel.
That's coming. That is coming.
Coming up.
and the issue of trying to get our young people onto bikes. So what we need is funding for both school cycle training and also these old cyclists who are coming back and want, adults who want to cycle again. Now, Will can probably say more about this, but I do understand that there is finally, after much toing and froing between DFT and TfL, some funding that will come to the boroughs in terms of cycle training. And clearly this it's kind of fallen through the cracks. But I think there's a will on all sides to make sure that we do find some funding for cycle training, because it's critical.
Absolutely. And Will, do you want to clarify what funding is available? Because it's I know I had in a Mayor's question that was answered, unlike the many that haven't been, that Caroline mentioned earlier, but the Bikeability Trust, you were looking at being able to get funding through that. Is that right?
There's definitely a will on this side, and we've been working really hard on this. As you all know, I've always said safe infrastructure is absolutely key to getting people cycling, but that's not enough. And so we have to have some of those proactive measures. Training is absolutely key, as well as other behaviour change programs to engage people. That's why, previously we had doubled the investment in bike training, similarly in terms of grants to communities. However, as we've said before, the financial situation changed massively due to the COVID crisis, and there was no funding in the TfL support package for bike training. The rest of the country gets funding through the Bikeability Trust directly from the Department for Transport, and this is something I've been talking to government extensively about over the last 8 weeks. I think we're having some extremely positive conversations at the moment. We're just dotting I's and crossing T's. I really hope we're making an announcement imminently to get bike training up and running and sharing the money that we hope to have secured among all the boroughs. As Julian said, traditionally we've trained both for children as well as adults. I think kids need to continue to get some of the training, but given the pressures that schools will be under and the massive uptake in bikes coming out of hibernation, new adult cycling, I would imagine there might be a bit of changing that approach to focus a bit more on adults. I do want to just pay tribute. As you know, we've invested in some of the cycling grants over many years for communities and engaging people. People have continued to volunteer in that space over the last few weeks in very difficult circumstances to enable people. I know the London Cycling Campaign have introduced a bike buddy system. So if people are new to cycling and want to find a route in their local areas, that bike buddy system is working. So we're also looking at online cycling tools to help people come back in terms of confidence. So I hope that going forward we will have the face-to-face training back up. We'll have this sort of bike buddy system that's being done by wonderful volunteers across the city, as well as some online tools to help that. And I really hope that we'll be making an announcement in the coming days, I would hope.
Lovely, thank you for that. And actually the mayoral answer I had from June does say you're hoping to spend £4 million on delivering and promoting
that was
mixed
our
live
ask,
face-to-face.
So I think that was certainly what our ask was. That's £2 million less than what we had been budgeted and training for. You know, obviously one asks and one doesn't always get everything one asks, but obviously we're just clarifying the final numbers at the moment.
Lovely. And I just want to bring Nicole in here. I mean, we've seen that surveys show that the cycling population is not really reflective of London as a whole. Wondering what help you think specifically should be given to perhaps older people, to women, to others, and what else can be done to get increased levels of cycling?
Well, I think a lot of the things that are all being proposed, but just to reiterate, I mean, training is really important for underrepresented groups. So building up those confidence, especially if you don't have those role models, you know, close at hand that are already cycling. The bike buddy system is a really good way to partner up people with those who are already knowledgeable, those who are already cycling, with those who are looking to build their confidence. And I think a lot of what Will has been saying, you know, if you want a functioning network that feels safe for your journey, just having strips of paint going nowhere is not going to get people to have that mode shift. Junctions, dangerous junctions, and addressing them are really important, especially for women and ethnic minorities and those groups, to encourage them to take up cycling. But yeah, of course, you know, we have a lot of cyclists who are already male, mainly white, often younger to middle-aged. Just seeing people like yourself cycling and seeing people cycle in other things other than lycra is important. But low traffic streets have really helped to encourage, I think, children to cycle and to cycle in your local neighborhoods. And what I alluded to earlier around sort of building these 15-20-minute neighborhoods, accommodating cycling trips or walking trips that feel safe around your local area are also really important. Yeah, basically safe networks, having those role models and having people to partner up with to build your confidence, and to build up knowledge of routes that are safe, and often the quieter routes. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you for that. And finally, maybe to Alex, what is being done to ensure adequate provision of secure cycle parking and storage across London? I think TfL in the past had an implementation plan. Is that being implemented? Is it being revised? Is it being increased?
I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but what I'll do is we can send them to you separately after this. There has been an increase in cycle parking, but in terms of the London Streetspace programme, this kind of 45 million, I don't think cycle parking is part of that, because it's about kind of rapid delivery of new routes and local traffic neighbourhoods, really. But I'll send you an update about where we are in terms of delivery of cycle parking after this week.
Okay, Will's indicated he might know.
Oh, he knows more than me, obviously. Will?
I don't know everything on this, but in terms of the as you know, we were very committed to the bike parking. I think, following on from Nicole said, other things that we do need is every bike journey needs to start somewhere and stop somewhere, and that needs to be secure, because, and if it isn't, you know, I had a bike stolen relatively recently, and it's devastating. I know members of this panel have had bikes stolen, and it's devastating. And I'm in the fortunate position that I could get another one through the Cycle to Work scheme, where many Londoners don't have this option and can't afford to replace their bikes, and that makes that people are less likely to cycle. So this is extremely serious and is a key part of our overall plans. Sadly, with the change in funding, again, that's been on pause with the rest of the Healthy Streets investment. But as part of this, we have been investing, as part of the Streetspace programme, there has been investment of, I think, 700 new bike spaces in central London on the Transport for London road network, and those are already going in. I think the vast majority have gone in now. The other point that I made earlier is actually putting more bike parking spaces in those outer London transport hubs, so around underground stations. As part of that, I think I responded to a couple of Assembly members as part of those longer journeys, and cycling to those stations. So there are, I think, 280 temporary bike parking spaces being made available at the London Underground stations. But quite frankly, this is not enough. Even, scratching the surface. Before the pandemic, we estimated that there was a need for 23,000 more bike spaces in inner London to cope, and 36,000 across all of London. I think that was from our study. I think the analysis, everything I've seen, and with the numbers going up, that will only increase. So we're going to have to think more imaginatively about this. I held a round table with the business improvement districts because this is of everyone's interest. If businesses want, if you have a business and you want cyclists to come in, then providing bike parking is definitely the way to do it. So Westfield, for example, have turned over huge areas of car parking to bikes. After conversations with them saying, actually, this is how we can get people in and spend some of those cyclist pounds, allow people to make those safe journeys to their high streets and get a bike parking space on those routes. So talking to the bids, how do we think about street storage on private land? How can we, how can we encourage employers to be thinking about turning over maybe some of the car parking spaces they have to bike parking spaces while providing some of the, not just for customers, but for employees. We're working with the NHS to improve one of the London's biggest employers to improve the bike parking there. So we are trying to be as imaginative as possible. With the resources that we have available, we do not have the budget to be able to deliver the bike parking that London needs. That's why everybody has a role to play in this, whether it's boroughs, it's businesses, it's across the board. And I think we need to be thinking imaginatively on how we do that. I don't have all the answers. I know some of the numbers, but I don't have all the solutions. But it is amazing when you start talking to some of the businesses in the improvement areas, how keen they are for this. Because going back to what I was talking about with Tony on Soho, people are cycling into West London, to Central London and the new West End area, but they need somewhere to lock their bikes that's secure.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then I would just add, obviously, we also need to accommodate parking for people who can't keep it on their private property. So people living in flats, people who need to also store at the other end of their journeys. So whether that's sort of these cycle hoops, secure parking, taking away car parking spaces along routes, but of course it needs to be catered for at both ends.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. And that's a whole nother set of questions that we might touch on in the under 18s section. I have an indication from Assembly Member Bailey and then Assembly Member Prince who'd like to follow up on this. Can we do so briefly and then move on to Assembly Member McCartney's question? So, Assembly Member Bailey.
I think my question has been covered because it was on bike training. I think we've covered it.
Super. Thank you very much. And Assembly Member Prince. Unmute.
Yeah, just very quickly, Will, perhaps we could have a discussion about this offline. But obviously, bike security very important, but motorcycles as well. They need to be kept secure when we put in motorcycle bays. Can there be secure fixings for them? That will help to reduce crime as well as help to make it more attractive. Also, have you considered parking for scooters? And I mean the new electric scooters, because they are coming, whatever way we look at it. It's something you might want to look at for the future. And just a quick complaint about the removal of 2 motorcycle parking bays in Tooley Street with nothing being replaced. But we can deal with that offline if you like, to save time.
Let's follow up with all that offline. Really happy to.
So, thank you very much. Actually, very important questions, but as you say, can be picked up offline. I'd like now to move on to the last 2 questions in this section. Assembly Member McCartney, if you'd like to ask your questions.
Thank you. I'm going to be asking about the government's wanting to suspend under 18s travel. If I can start with Alex, and then I'm going to come to Julian afterwards. Yeah. So, Alex, just a few confirmatory things to start with, if you wouldn't mind. I understand we've now got confirmation that the government is proposing this only as a temporary measure. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do we understand what temporary means as part of as far as the government's concerned?
No. So I'm not just going to give you one-word answers, but the duration, they're saying it's for the duration of the crisis, and clearly none of us know the duration of the crisis really, but they are saying it's certainly a temporary measure but there's no statement as to when it will start, but also when it will finish either.
And you said earlier that in actual fact, it could be, it's a very changing circumstance, so we could in a few months be looking at more people on buses and tubes than we currently have.
I think there will be I think what you're seeing is a kind of slow but steady return to public transport. We're around 25% on the tube, and 2 months ago we were around 15% on the tube. Buses around 45%. It was around, but I think the big uptick, which we're all looking to manage, is in September, definitely. Yeah.
When schools start. So can I ask about that? Obviously, there's a significant number of children that would be entitled to free travel anyway. Under current entitlements. Has TfL done modelling as to how many children you think are not going to be taking, particularly the bus to school anymore, and will this suspension really have an impact on the amount of young people trying to get onto our buses?
We've done a lot of modelling on this issue, and I can it's probably worth me kind of getting a separate note sent to you on the kind of detailed modelling that is there, because the picture on public transport or transport choices to schools does vary significantly across London. In central and large parts of inner London, the dominant mode to school is by pedestrian, by people walking, and a small minority cycling. As you get further out, the bus becomes more and more important for people to get to school, and also as you go up the age groups, the bus becomes more important. So at the mild money of sixth form, the A-level subjects, it's more important because people are going further. So it's quite a kind of complicated position, really. Our view is that if there's a removal of the concession, I think it throws up a huge amount of issues about the technical issues about a ticketing system, how that's going to work. I think there's a process issue because the local authorities are required to consult on this. There's an equalities issue, a whole series of issues there, but there's also a practical administration issue because we won't be administering this. It will be individual schools and academies and local educational authorities. And I think we're nowhere near in a kind of fit place for any change for September. But clearly that is the aspiration to implement something for September.
Okay, well, we can all hope that that will not happen. I mean, London Travel Watch has done a useful survey of young people, have other youth organisations, and young people are saying that they're worried about the stress on their family finances at a time when families are really struggling and on the edge, and it's likely to get worse. They're worried about a loss of independence. They're worried about walking to school in certain areas and being victim of crime, for example. And the transport system is seen as a very safe way to get around our city. There's lots of unintended consequences as well. And you may know that I've chaired a meeting with stakeholders around this with Heidi Alexander, from Child Poverty Action Group to the Association of Colleges and Young People themselves. And for example, the Association of Colleges say that they get a reduced bursary from the Department of Education because there is free travel in London. And so if this is taken away, they would be looking at having increased funding to them. So there seems to be lots of unintended consequences to this. Do you get the sense that in your discussions with government that they are waking up to the difficulties of this and it's not as simple as they thought it was?
Short answer is yes. I think they recognise that it is a much more complicated change, and it's quite interesting within the kind of funding deal that this relates to. The changing the Freedom Pass in the morning peak was implemented quickly and pretty straightforwardly. The changes to the congestion charge again went to relatively straightforwardly. This is the most complicated condition in the funding deal, in my view, and I think there's layers of complexity that I don't think were understood when that was originally inserted into the deal at the last moment. And I think that's becoming more and more apparent. But I do think the one that I've read the London Travel Watch report. I think it's a very good report. And I think one of the key things for me is the departments are recognising, Department of Transport are recognising it's a very complicated issue. They have said that they will draft the Equalities Impact Statement. And all of those reports that you talk about from Child Poverty Action Group, the Travel Watch, I think they need to be sent through to the Department of Transport so that they do formulate a equalities impact assessment that genuinely addresses all of those, or at least understands and recognises all those issues before a decision is made. I think. So the very good report, I thought, the Travel Watch. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Julian a question, but then I'm going to come back to you, Alex, if I can. Julian, from a local authority point of view, can you just briefly explain what this suspension of travel for young people would mean to the young people that you serve? And secondly, from an administrative point of view, are local authorities really set up to be administering the free travel requirements that would be required under this? Because presumably you have the data as to who would be entitled to free travel or not.
Sorry, my mute button was taking a while there. So clearly, I think if the government's aspiration to implement this in September were the case, I think it's virtually impossible for boroughs to do what would need to be done in that timescale. The statutory duty to provide free travel for primary age children living over 2 miles away from their school, or for high school children over 3 miles away, falls on local authorities. And so we would have to deal with this if that's what happens and this goes ahead, because that statutory duty to provide for those groups still exists. Now, we've been asked, all boroughs have been asked to do a survey of our school children and ask them how they plan to travel to school in September. However, this has been kind of asked of us in July, essentially, just weeks before schools break up. So again, it's been very, very difficult to get a meaningful consultation or survey of our school children. Of course, most of our school children are not coming into school at the moment. You've only got limited numbers of school children who are actually attending school at the moment. So that's a virtually impossible scenario there. But armed with the information that we've managed to glean, clearly the dependence on public transport of kids getting to school is still significant, and clearly we want to do everything we can to try and get them walking and cycling, and we'll, as boroughs, will push that message out as much as we possibly can. I've already written to all parents talking about all the things that they need to do to prepare for their children coming back in September, and active travel was part of that message, but also the uncertainty over what is happening makes it very difficult for any of us to plan. So I think we're kind of between a rock and a hard place as local authorities, and you say that we have the data, but with it being August, it will be difficult.
Yeah, I think virtually impossible. And again, Alex, if I can come back to you, it does seem that this is a ridiculous thing to ask, given the technical and difficult challenges, if this is to be a temporary measure. But if I can also ask you, earlier on you talked about redistributing buses from inner to outer London, particularly around those start times, and highlighted certain routes that may be overcrowded with school children. Can I ask to give a bit more detail about that? And are you also looking at perhaps buying in some coaches if there is a real issue on certain routes?
Well, what we've done is we've done an analysis of the bus network and identified 66 schools in London. There's some 3,100 schools in London, and we've identified 66 schools, principally, well, they're all secondary schools in outer London, where we think there is a good chance that the bus network will struggle when the schools return in September. And that's because they are schools with high levels of bus usage, or they are in areas where there's kind of clusters of secondary schools, and we know that there's kind of peaks happening there at the moment. So what we've done is all of those 66 schools, we've contacted them, we're in a regular dialogue with them, and we are asking them to look at this issue about staggering their start and finish times. Because just staggering it by half an hour, we're not talking about a massive thing about only going in the morning, only going in the afternoon, just a kind of half-hour shift in some year groups at the start of the school day and at the end of the school day could make a really big difference about how you manage the kind of peak periods at the start and end of the school day. Because certainly at the end, it's quite an intense, half an hour, 45 minutes, hour, whatever. And if you just spread that a bit, it makes a big difference, really. So we're in an active dialogue with all of those, the top 66, as it were. We're also sending out travel advice to all 3,100, and we've got a bespoke web page on our site to highlight the travel advice that they should take, which is what Julian's referred to in terms of walk and cycle, look at different stagger times. If you are, we've got a lot of people using the bus network, be mindful it might take them a bit longer. The other thing we're going to do is that this advice is going out to schools towards the end of term, and we will repeat that messaging at the end of August or early September, because I'll give you an example. My own son is waiting on his GCSEs. He doesn't know what secondary school he's going to go to, and he doesn't know whether he's going to be walking to a school or getting a bus to a school, because he doesn't know. So I think we have to reissue that advice to the new kind of cohort of students when they know where they're going, really. The other thing is probably worth finishing off is that we are looking at the issue about coaches, but I think they will have limited value, to be perfectly honest. I think the area that we are examining is what is the kind of carrying capacity of a bus. And at the moment, it's kind of 30 on a double-decker and 15 on a single-decker. And one of the things we are looking at with health experts is, for school peaks, do we look at different ways of managing that bus network for those school peaks, so that, I know, for example, the top deck is for school kids at the start and end of the school day, really. So we are looking at that issue and working with health advisors as to whether we need to think about a different way of managing the bus network for that September return.
That's really positive that you're doing that work and representing outer London boroughs, and my own child going to a sixth form college. I'm pleased to report that they have put their start time back half an hour for one year group and 45 minutes for another. So that message seems to be getting through. But my last question is about the school street scheme. And I know that messages went out from TfL to schools asking them to contact their local authorities and really to bid for some of this money that was available. How's that going? And have you had a positive reaction to that?
Yes, we have. And have you got the numbers, Will? Your numbers,
so we've had a really positive response to this. I think that school streets have been they were, as you know, Joanne, they were something that some boroughs were beginning to embrace before all this happened. But I think I look at my kids' school when I do drop-off, and the crowded space around the entrances to primary schools, which particularly if you've got traffic moving past, I live in complete fear of, my kids have got 2 meters lodged in their heads now, like they've got no tomorrow. I've got to stay 2 meters apart from people. This is all we've been talking about for the last 3 months. What I really don't want them doing is walking to school and then stepping out when they see someone coming through, and it's just not worth thinking about. So the idea of having timed closures around schools to make it safe for people to socially distance around these very, very busy places that have got kids, teachers, staff and parents all coming in, and siblings and everything else, makes a huge amount of sense to me. They can't be done in every site, but we are encouraging it. We've written to, as you said, and thanks to your team and colleagues across the board for helping write to the things. We did quite a lot of press on this. The response has been really good. I think we've now funded over 400 different school streets schemes across London. I think there's more appetite to do more. I've been talking to boroughs who want to just make this the default. And unless there's a really good reason why you don't do a school street, is the sort of new way. It's not particularly expensive in most cases. But the benefits aren't just for the social distancing and the COVID piece. There is also, we know that where it's happened, it's cleaned up air quality around schools. And the very last thing we want is our kids breathing in toxic air. And also in terms of coming back to that point around the health, the wider public health benefits. When I went to visit a school with a school street in Greenwich before this happened, they've seen a 54% fall in the number of people driving, and that directly corresponding to people walking, cycling, but actually scooting more. That kids seem to like these sort of scooters and that rather than bikes because they're in local areas. But this is great for, we've got the most inactive kids we've got the most, London, 80% of kids are inactive in London. We've got to get people more active to tackle the inactivity crisis that we face, and that will help, keep us fit and healthy to manage the ongoing challenges with the pandemic and other chronic disease issues. So hopefully, I'm really pleased. I hope this is a positive step, and I think as more schools see how this works, I can imagine this becoming a widespread thing, and it's phenomenal news. And I hope that this is, a small silver lining out of a very, very dark cloud.
Yeah, thank you. That's really heartening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember McCartney. And I have indications for 3 follow-ups, but I would just like to reflect, actually, that one of the things that I learned very, very early on in my time as an elected representative was around that issue of the real issue around pollution first thing in the morning, and how much that very much affects schools and school streets. So I really appreciate the difference that will make. So I have Assemblymember Russell, Assemblymember Bailey and Assemblymember Shah, who'd all like to pick up and come in on this issue. Assemblymember Russell.
Yes, thank you very much,
And then we must move on.
Very briefly, 2 points. One, I've heard about parents getting letters from schools about not bringing scooters and bikes to store in the school playground because the schools are worried about the physical space. And I'm just wondering if TfL can do some messaging for schools to make sure that that pupils are encouraged to scoot and cycle to school. The other thing is about the secondary age young people, and whether or not they get their free travel back. With the capacity issues on public transport, surely it makes sense to be doing some cycle training for these groups so that they get tailored help to work out a route from their home to get to their school safely. I mean, it should be, with all the street-space measures that are taking place in London, we ought to be able to get to a point where 16, 17-year-olds can cycle safely to school, and that we do everything we can to enable them to do it. So if it's possible for the cycle training work that TfL is supporting to include sort of tailored cycle training for that kind of cohort who are particularly the sixth formers, that they can cycle to school, that would be absolutely amazing. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
So I think that the cycling to school is hugely important. Taking away the free travel for under 18s isn't the way to do that, but it is about supporting people to do that and providing those opportunities. The cycle training is provided through the boroughs, and as I said before, I still think there's a role for cycle training for schools, and I hope that will include this, because I share your ambition. I really hope that we are able to get most people to be able to sort of have a safe route to school and allow that to be part of everyday life.
Thank you.
Sorry, could I just check if Julian has anything to say from the borough perspective on that issue of cycle training for, particularly for sixth formers, so they can be independent about cycling to school?
Yeah, absolutely agree. We need the funding to be able to do it. I think there's also a question about the availability of bikes for secondary school students as well. So, yeah, we need to think about how we can get more bikes to them too.
Yeah, absolutely, and also storage space in flatted developments and a whole range of other things. So I think that's an ongoing point to be made. Thank you, Assemblymember Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one to Julian and maybe Will as well. Julian, what work has been done to let children know who are on free school meals and who live the required distance away from school that they will still be getting free travel?
Do you want me to come on that?
Sorry, Sean, I was having trouble with my mute button. It keeps disappearing, which is quite disconcerting. Clearly, that's the group that we want to talk to. I think we're as I've said, we certainly from my borough's perspective, we've been sending out messages to all of our pupils, but while ever there's this hiatus and not quite knowing what's going to happen, we've kind of said, well, we will update you when we know more. And until we have some certainty, it's very difficult to give any clear messages to people other than that there is an issue and we'll try and deal with it when we have some certainty.
But doesn't the current proposal say that these groups of children will continue to receive free travel? So that feels very clear to me, whereas having a hiatus, not communicating that can cause confusion, because for a different group of children there is, I accept, an uncertainty, but for a particular group of children you have certainty, the group of children whose parents will need to know most. So has anybody taken that into account in their communications?
I think,
so absolutely we have, and we've given that message. But again, we don't quite know how this is going to work, and you know, you have to have a system in place to administer the mechanism for allowing those children who qualify for it the free travel, and that's the bit that we don't have the answer to. We know that there are children who are going to be continuing to qualify for it, but we don't have the mechanism to deliver a pass that says here you go, here's your free travel.
I just think it's. Thank you for your answer, Julian, and William. I'd like to hear what you've got to say, but it just seems to me the message is you will continue. You use the word continue to receive free travel. How that happens, you could then talk about later. That message feels very useful, because I work with a number of people who free travel is very, very important to them and their child for umpteen different reasons, and they believe that they are not going to receive free travel when we all know they are going to. And I believe it'd be a kindness to let those people know that that's going to continue. William?
Yeah, so I was just going to add that I think we really need to, we're waiting for more clarity from government and how this is going to be done, who's eligible for free travel under the new proposal. So the equalities and impact assessment, as said, is being done by DFT, but I think there is a real challenge that if you send out a message saying you'll be getting free travel, it implies that everyone who doesn't receive that, then they won't be getting it. So it could add to further confusion. So I sort of really echo the point that without that clarity from government, that it is very difficult to do this communications. I'm particularly worried around people who probably need to return to education the most are facing the biggest barriers in accessing it. And for the 17 and 18-year-olds who've chosen colleges, I'm thinking of Alex's son and other people who maybe have got colleges in different boroughs, they could end up facing paying multiple adult fares under what I understand to be the proposals at the moment. So, that for those people who need the education most could be hit hardest and really restrict opportunities. So there's an awful lot of worry about this. There isn't a lot of clarity. And I think doing communications without the clarity could risk making it even more confusing to the poor people who are having to who are worried about it. And I agree with you that there is an urgent need to understand this and get to a conclusion.
I agree with you, Will. The clarity is important, but there seems to be a strong communication around the fact that some people may well have this subsidy removed, and absolutely no communication around the most vulnerable people will not have that removed. That's why I asked the question. My other question to you, Will, would be if the temporary removal of this concession goes ahead, what other work has been done to provide some kind of alternative? Is that possible? Is it possible for the mayor to provide some kind of alternative? Has any thinking been done around that?
I'm not an expert in this, but this is, as somebody said earlier, this is so horribly complex, yeah? And this is something that we've never done in London, that every local authority, every school, the number of people who are on free school meals changes, people who are on universal benefits change. Absolutely. This is a whole new system that London has never had to deal with because we've had an existing system that works very well and works well for our children. So I just want to reiterate just the complexity of bringing in a whole new fare structure during the school holidays at a time for a temporary measure. I can really understand why this is the mayor's view that this isn't the right thing to do at the moment. But Alex and Joanne, I think, have got Alex might know more details on that, and I think Joanne's got her hand up as well.
I will bring Joanne in a minute, but from my perspective, I think it just illustrates that the whole process was ill thought through and is largely unworkable. But if I might bring Councillor Assembly Member McCartney in, and then Assembly Member Shott, and then we must move on. Important in all of this is.
Yeah, it was just sort of clarifying the point that Sean made. I think at the moment the government are looking at children, young people in different age brackets, so you can't give a blanket message about free school meals or who will be entitled, because different age groups will be affected differently, which adds to the complication.
And I might also add that actually families' individual circumstances will be changing with the ending of the furlough scheme through August, and you may well find that there are families who have to move on to universal credit and therefore will become eligible. I think it is hugely complex. I would like to bring Assembly Member Shah in, and then we can move on. Assembly Member Shah?
Thank you, Chair. Alex, government has been encouraging people to use public transport, but like under 18s, there's also temporary suspension of 60+ freedom pass for the morning hours. Now, that again, we don't know what the suspension is until, I don't know if you have any update, because Age UK and many other stakeholder organizations are campaigning against this discriminatory suspension. Can you tell us whether how long this suspension is likely to continue?
The short answer is no. It came into effect for the morning peak only. Yeah. I think 9:30 in mid-June, and it is one of these kind of temporary changes with no kind of fixed end date. It does really depend on how the pandemic continues and how long social distancing rules are required on our network. So it was introduced relatively straightforwardly from a systems perspective. I get that there were kind of other issues with it, but it was issued quite quickly. It has had an effect, I have to say, as well, and we've been tracking the usage of the freedom passes and other concessions, and it does seem that people have complied with it and shifted their journey to later in the day. I know it's sometimes difficult if you've got a hospital appointment and things like that for that early morning shift, but it does seem to have had an effect and more straightforward. The under 18, as I've said before, it's just layers of complexity that are still being worked through, and we don't have a product at the moment.
Yeah, the problem clearly is that, as you'll hear from Age UK and their campaign, very, very clearly, there are this is discriminatory. There are negative impact from this morning peak time suspension. And quite frankly, there needs to be clarity as to when this will be lifted, and whatever we can do to get this information from whatever source of government. We need to have that, because you are locking out another section of vulnerable people who need that freedom to travel. So we are having two-tier system here. At one level, we're saying use public transport, but then we are telling another section of people who are vulnerable that no, you can't travel during peak hours. I don't think it's fair. Thank you, Chair.
Yep. Okay. I hear it loud and clear. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And I have Nicole would like to say something, and then we really must move on to the final section. But do come in, Nicole.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a few quick remarks. So all of the concessionary bus passes were introduced primarily to sort of tackle social exclusion and to encourage social mobility, so to improve access to opportunities and education. And I think in the last sort of chats that we've had here, a lot of it is only focused on access to schools, but of course young adults, youths, benefit hugely from the opportunities that they can reach within London other than just education, and that this will improve or hinder their prospects going forward long term, and it will allow them to access a part-time job to help support their family, and the loss of that will be a huge loss of independence for them, and I think also if we're thinking about sort of the transport system as a whole, the loss of free passes for kids might mean that the whole family will have knock-on effects for the transport system. So you might, for instance, opt to use the car because now it's not free for you anymore to have your kids ride on the bus. And this in turn will, of course, lead to more traffic, more pollution. So it has wider implications, I think, as all I'm trying to point out here. And the opportunities are not exclusive to education.
Absolutely, and it's education and in that wider, the widest context for those who start very often with the playing field definitely stacked against them. As a former mayor once said, London is a wonderful place if you can afford to get to all those things that are now free, like museums and whatever else, but actually lots of other activities, leadership skills, lots of different things. So thank you very much for that intervention. I'd like to move on to our final section, which is on future planning, and I'd like to keep this as tight as possible because it's been a long session. The first set of questions are being taken by Assembly Member Bailey. There are 4 of them. I'd like to try and keep this to 15 minutes if we possibly can. And just to give notice that Assembly Member Prince wanted to come in after number 3, which is dealing with long-term road user charging plans. So Assembly Member Bailey, if you'd ask your questions, that'd be really helpful.
In the interest of keeping to time, I believe question 3.1 has largely been answered, so I'll start with the next one.
Okay, thank you very much.
What are the implications of COVID-19 on the future transport planning? How have any short-term, medium or long-term changes in demand as a result of COVID-19 crisis been factored into future transport planning? I think we'll start with Alex and go from there.
Thank you, Sean. And that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Really?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I think we are very much alive to that issue, and we are looking at a range of scenarios about what it could mean for the city and what it could mean for transport in the city. And if you look at historical changes in our network, for 7/7, it had a big impact, but it was quite short and temporary. For 2012, it was significant impact, but it was 3 weeks and we were back to normal. This is much longer. This is 4 months, probably longer. This is the first time I've worn a tie in 4 months. It's a big change in people's travel behaviours and their working lives, really. And I think there was a real case to be made to say that this could have a longer lasting and more profound effect on this city, how it develops, its scale of growth, and also the transport infrastructure and the transport services that we need to provide for it. So we've done a lot of work on what we call scenario planning. We've looked at kind of 5 scenarios about what it could mean for the city. The most straightforward one is a kind of business as usual return and a quick bounce back to what it could be. There's another set of scenarios we're looking at, which we've told. One is called low carbon localism, which is, and I think Nicole referred to this issue about the kind of 15-minute city, is this thing about, the outer London high streets feel very busy, central London feels very quiet, and it could be, are we seeing a more kind of localism set of positions in the city, a set local way of living? It could be into a more remote way of living. It could mean that the commuter belt becomes even further afield and people commute in less but further. And then there's other kind of riskier ones about, we get less investment in London and London declines to a degree. Or it could go the other way about, London becoming bigger and, a kind of stronger kind of urbanisation agenda. So we've got 5 scenarios, and I've got a paper going to the board next week, which has been published last night on this issue. We've done an overview about the Mayor's transport strategy, and it's summarised those 5. And what we're doing is looking at our long-term capital planning through the lens of each of those 5 scenarios, really, and just saying that if we are looking at a kind of a low-carbon localism agenda, and that's the way that this city develops, what does it mean for what do we provide for the bus network? What does it mean for walking and cycling? What does it mean for those big new rail projects we're looking at, really? So I think we are at a very interesting point of time, but as I say, we are thinking and looking at that kind of rising scanning exercise to think about what does it mean for the city, and what do we need? How do we need to structure ourselves, but also how do we need to think about what are the next round of investments and way of delivering our services going forward? So I'll put a plug to the Mayor's Transport Strategy Update report that goes to the board next week. At the back, it's got a summary of that kind of scenario planning analysis that we've done. But it's really interesting work at the moment.
It sounds like it, and I know myself, my colleagues will be very, very interested in that, because London is growing, but is its shape changing will be important as to how we move forward. Let me take a bit of a turn and go somewhere else. Road pricing is often talked about in London. Has the COVID-19 crisis, how has that affected your study into road pricing and what that might look like?
Well, the Mayor's Transport Strategy is still as it was pre-COVID. There's a policy in there to say that we will be looking at kind of distance-based charging, and that policy remains. We have the focus in the pandemic has been on that issue about restarting the congestion charge on the 18th of May and extending it in terms of time and days on the 22nd of June. Those changes are temporary. And I think one of the things we need to look at, a bit like the other changes we've talked about, is what are the things that we need to consider, probably next year, I suspect, about what elements of those are made permanent, or do we go back to the way the scheme operated before? So I think there will be, that's probably the most immediate issue to look at from a road user charging perspective. We still are pressing on with the low emission zone, which is probably going to come in the changes in March next year, and we're still progressing with the ultra low emission zone to the extension rather to North and South Circular for October next year. Beyond that, there isn't any, there isn't a defined scheme or such to work through. I think that's very much dependent on next year's mayoral election, as we know.
Yes, I'm sure. Given the long-term financial challenges facing TfL, are you anticipating a much scaled-down capital program that primarily focuses on maintaining the existing network, or will you still be having, a big ambitious plan to grow and add new bits to our network?
I think we will have to reconsider the capital programme in light of the crisis, and it's quite interesting. Will has talked a lot about the walking and cycling initiatives that have been delivered, and there's a big challenge about the cost of making some of those permanent. That probably means potentially more money in that area than we've looked at before, really. But I think in terms of how we position ourselves for the next funding deal with government and also the comprehensive spending review, we need to have a credible long-term capital plan and funding settlement with them. And that is part of the discussions with government on there. Because one of the kind of truisms for all of these scenarios we're looking at is London is highly likely to continue to grow. We are the fastest growing region in the UK at the moment. And that growth, we've got more pressure on our network, and we need to have a credible investment strategy for this city. I get the whole levelling up agenda, but that doesn't mean about levelling down London. That means about investing elsewhere, but it also means that you need a credible investment strategy for central London. So we are cognizant of that for the funding settlement for H2, the next sub-running round. We're also mindful of the Chancellor's announcement yesterday on the comprehensive spending review. We'll be pushing our agenda there, particularly on the issue about carbonisation and decarbonisation rather. But I think it's quite clear that we need a credible long-term funding settlement that deals with the capital projects going forward. It might mean that some of them, like Crosswood Tea or Bakerloon, take longer to deliver, but it doesn't mean to say you abandon them. They're still important projects for this city that is growing.
Okay. And how are you going to manage this movement? And we'll have a comment to make here, from projects that were temporary into being permanent. Will there be an additional capital cost there? And Will might want to say something about how you manage the relationship with the public, because the idea that you give something space because it's permanent is very different. Because it's temporary is very different to if you knew it was going to be permanent, wouldn't it? You'd have a very different conversation. How's that going to be managed from a financial point of view and also from a trust point of view? Because we all know, a resident said to me, possession is 9/10 of the law. Once you put something in, it's very hard to undo it, even if it is terrible. So how are we going to manage that?
I think the key thing at the moment is to monitor and understand the effect of what's gone in now in terms of those temporary measures, or the low traffic neighbourhoods or the cycle scheme. So you're monitoring in terms of traffic impacts and usage levels, but also what people think of it. So we are, collating all the views, all the letters, some positive, some negative, about the schemes in there, so that when you do make that decision about whether they're permanent, you probably might need to go through another process in terms of consultation, but it's informed by the reality about what was the effect of it in a temporary state. But there is a real challenge in switching from temporary to permanent, in that permanent costs you a lot more than temporary. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got for the next funding round. But Will has alluded to this before, where you've got this alliance between, the Mayor and the Prime Minister and Number 10 saying they want these kind of initiatives there. So we need to use that to make sure that we get a decent funding settlement for the next funding round. Now, Will, if you want to add something to that.
I touch on. We talked a bit about the consultation, the engagement, having those online resources, making sure that we are collating that feedback. I think some of the schemes that are going in are existing schemes that have been consulted on and are being delivered, which they might be being delivered at the moment in temporary materials and at 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the speed. The thing then would be looking at how much money we've got and how we go back to make some of those permanent. I think I touched on earlier, Sean, this idea of temporary plus. I think that the idea that we're going to suddenly have the money to go back and do everything that we wanted to do and everything that's consulted on and everything out there in sort of York stone that's gold plated and looks phenomenal, that's just not the reality of the financial reality at the moment. So I think we're going to have to look at it from, well, what are the priorities? What are the safety priorities of making some of this permanent? Are there sections of this that can be done permanently to make them safe and to make them work and to make them work better for everybody in the area? Because as you know, if you can't get the traffic signals right in some schemes, or they need to be changes to some of that infrastructure, that will help alleviate neighbouring traffic and congestion and other things. So I think we're going to have to look at it scheme by scheme and see, well, what sections of this should be done can be done permanently first to improve the scheme, and then there are other things that we could come back to. Maybe, for example, the wands that are sitting behind Julian, is that something that we could leave in place for a bit longer rather than to redo all the drainage, all the cabling, all the curbs and everything else that might need to go to make a scheme like that permanent? So I think we're going to have to look at it on a scheme by scheme basis, and again, think differently. We're going to be in a very different world financially. We're going to be in a very, very, very different world in terms of demand and what's needed from the public.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. And Assembly Member Prince, you wanted to come in briefly.
Very quickly, thank you, Chair. Really a question for Alex. Clearly, just to let you know that here in East London, we're very much opposed to the expansion of the ULEZ, but the point I wanted to make was I understand and in some respects support the need for modal shift in London from the car to other forms of transport, such as cycling, walking, motorcycles, of course, taxis. But in the outer London boroughs, especially boroughs like Redbridge, more so even in Haven, which is a very, very large borough, but it doesn't have that connectivity. Sean can confirm that it doesn't have that connectivity, especially sort of north to south, that you would have in central London. And I think there needs to be a recognition of that. You did mention earlier about buses not being so busy in the centre. So is there any chance we could have some out in the outer London boroughs?
Yeah, well, that's something we are actively looking at. Is there an opportunity to redistribute some of the supply? But as I say, at the moment, the focus is very much on those 66 hotspot schools where we're fairly confident there's going to be a problem that needs to be addressed when schools return. So that's the priority at the moment, is looking at additional supply in that area. I'm well aware of the challenges in boroughs like Havering, and I've been in contact with the Chief Exec there a few times on that very issue about north-south or orbital connectivity. Our challenge, I think, is you're going forward in terms of our capital settlement, is how do we get the money in to address those kind of challenges in outer London, where it's harder to get the money from developers and other sources to get the infrastructure in, but clearly there is a need for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much, and I couldn't agree more with that. As somebody who comes from Barnet, I recognise the challenge there, but actually there are opportunities in that as well. If I can now move on to Assembly Member Pigeon has the next two questions.
Some of it's been covered. The message from government, Alex, has sort of changed really in the last week or so about rather than just being essential journeys to being, you should travel now. Are there plans, given Julian Bell mentioned earlier about the nighttime economy and how important that is to London, are there plans to reintroduce the night tube?
Not at the moment, no. And I think that is something that we will have to take stock on when we're clearer about when the kind of nighttime economy gets going again. When theatres and concert halls get going. At the moment, the night bus network continues to function. It has functioned during the pandemic. We're not aware of any problems with that bus network. As you know, a large number of people who use it are going to and from work, and that continues to be the case. But at the moment, I think the priority for those train drivers who were on the night tube is to provide that extra capacity on the daytime tube.
The daytime.
Get up to the levels that we need.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. We talked earlier about hotspots and how you're publicising particular interchange stations and other areas, and also hours of the day. I think you talked about on the network where it's busier. Are you looking perhaps in September, as schools reopen, to look at promoting where there are hotspots on the bus network in order for people to make that informed decision? I'll stay at home for another half hour before going out, or actually I'm going to get on my bike or walk so I don't have that huge contact with people. Is that something you're considering, or will you consider?
We are considering that issue. I think it's a really important point, because I think we know that there are certain times of the day where the buses will become very well used by school children going to and from school, even with staggering. And I think one of the ways to address that pressure is advice to school children passengers that actually it might be better to use the network at a different time. So I think we are certainly looking at that issue. And one of the things we need to look at is about how we target that. In some parts of London, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
But I think in outer London, particularly around those 66 that I've referred to several times, I think that is something that we are looking at. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just, if I might just pick up very briefly the comment about the night bus. Have you seen increased pressure on night bus services as the hospitality industry begins to restart? And in the absence of those night tube services, as that hospitality industry grows back into action, how are you going to maintain safe, physical, distanced night bus services?
We're not aware of any substantial pressure on the night bus network at all. I think what we're seeing is a reduction in flows there, because basically the most night bus network is made up of probably the majority of people going to work and people going to and from an event. Now, clearly, all of those people going to and from an event are not on the bus anymore. So there's actually social distancing is not a problem on the night bus network as far as I'm aware at all. I think one of the interesting things about the hospitality trade is it does feel pretty slow at the moment in terms of, if you go to central London, not all of these establishments have reopened. And that goes back to a point I made earlier. I think part of the reason for that is they're reliant on, office workers in that locality going to use the restaurant or the pub, things like that. So they're struggling, in some ways it makes more economic sense to take advantage of furlough and the business rate breaks and be shut rather than open with a very low level of takings, really. So, but it does feel as though that might well change in the autumn. But at the moment, so there are no significant pressures on the bus network, night bus network that I'm aware of.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We've got our last two questions. Assembly Member Shah has a question, number 8.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Alex, as everyone appreciates, Elizabeth Line is very, very important for Londoners. Last month, Tony Mack said his team would meet or beat the summer 2021 opening date for the central section of Elizabeth Line to open. Will it be open in time to contribute to pandemic response? Any comments, Alex?
I can say that the team are working flat out to make sure that is the case. The other thing is probably worth noting is that there is a Crossrail board this week. I can't remember if it's tomorrow or Friday, and that will provide an update, and it will also go to the TfL board next week in the kind of public domain about where they are on the scheme and the progress they're making towards the delivery and opening. The other thing is probably worth mentioning is that I have a new boss here, the new Commissioner Andy Byford, and I can assure you he completely gets that opening Crossrail as soon as possible is one of his top 2 priorities for this organisation. So I can assure you he's going to be looking at that the challenge with some vigour and energy. And we want to make sure that we get that project as open as quickly as we possibly can. But as I say, there'll be further public statements on it this week or next week at the TfL board.
I appreciate that both the Mayor and the new Commissioner are committed to this project and its priority. Question is, there's still so much uncertainty. Tony Mack very clearly made this comment last month but now we are hearing that this actually may not happen. It is very important in terms of recovery for London that Elizabeth Line is open as soon as possible, and we need clarity as to when we can, what is the new opening date, and that is something we would like to know. We'd like to be clarified. So if you can take the message back and let us know as soon as possible when the board has met, etc., what is the current timing for the central section to open.
Okay, I will do. Yep.
Please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I had one final question, and I think that the likely answer is that it'll be going to the update to the board next week. But what are the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for the delivery of the Mayor's transport strategy? And that question was addressed to everyone. So actually, it's an opportunity for all four of you just to have your final word on today before I thank you for a very, very interesting and full session. So if we'd like to start with Alex.
Yeah, there's a comprehensive report going to the board next Wednesday. It's in the public domain now, which answers that question really. We've been making good progress on the delivery of the Mayor's transport strategy objectives and the environment strategy. Clearly, there are risks with the pandemic about it being a kind of car-led recovery, and the report looks at that in some detail about what we need to do as a result of that. But I will make sure that you get a copy of that report after this meeting.
That would be very good. Thank you, Julian. If you any comments about that, I should have given you notice, shouldn't I, so you could find your button.
Not working.
There you go. We can hear you. Oh,
okay. It's still showing I'm muted on my screen. So obviously. The emphasis on active travel for me is the real focus in recovering from COVID. So the more walking and cycling, putting that infrastructure in, and you know the reason we chose those ones that are behind me was with half an eye on making those permanent. And allowing that cycling infrastructure to be there long term, and I think we haven't really talked about climate emergency today, but that's still right there, front and centre, as well as recovery from COVID. And so, active travel has got so many aspects about it which addresses both of those issues.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And the way Nicole smiled, I think she'd probably like to say something in her final remarks about that.
Yeah, so I think the core of the transport vision is still there, and what the COVID crisis really just highlights is the need to act fast to shift to that headline figure of 80% of all trips being by sustainable mode. I think the things I would like to just emphasise is that it needs to be a just and inclusive transport future that is focused around people and that is environmentally sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Will, final comments from you.
I think colleagues have covered a bit of this, but I think it shows what this has shown is that we can act fast. We can deal with crises across London, and we can act very fast to deal with that. And as I said earlier, we can't come out of this crisis by sowing the seeds of the next, whether that is an inactivity crisis and chronic disease, whether that's a public air quality crisis and coming out with a car-based recovery. But as Julian said, we have a big wave coming towards us with the climate emergency. And I think this shows that when people work together and we have a shared challenge, we can achieve an awful lot in a very short period of time, and Londoners have pulled together amazingly well to manage the really hard sort of challenges thrown with lockdown, all the problems that are coming, and I take great confidence from that. And I've been inspired by so many people who've really gone out of their way or are really struggling in difficult times. So again, I just want to say a big thank you to colleagues at TfL who have been delivering, borough officers and engineers around the city, the councillors, assembly members who've been hugely supportive in all of this, the campaign organisations, but above all the communities in London who have shown a degree of resilience, innovation and excitement around change. And I really hope, as I said before, there are some silver linings to this dark cloud. And I think one of them is those shows just what a great city we live in and what great people live here and how we can respond to a crisis, which gives me great hope for the future.
Thank you very much. That's as somebody who's a glass half full girl, I have to say I really appreciate that upbeat and positive last set of comments, because I think you're absolutely right. This has revealed all sorts of strengths in people and organisations. So thank you very much for an illuminating and dynamic discussion. I think we owe all four of you thanks for coming along and spending your time, but also sharing your thoughts with us. So thank you very much. Now, formally, I need to ask, can we note the report and the discussion?
Agree.
Thank you. And can we also agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and the party group leads to agree any output from today's meeting?
Agree.
And we'll take you up on all those offers of passing information on to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And we will now be seeing Travel Watch, but you are free to go and have lunch and get on with all the other things you need to do in your lives. Thank you very much.
Bye, Nicole.
Bye, Nicole, and pleasure to meet you virtually.
There's our next guest.
Right. Okay.
Oh.
So I'm just picking up. So thank you for bearing with us, and we will be ready for our next guest shortly. I'm just waiting for them to appear. Yes. I see an A, and I'm not sure who it is yet. Oh, well, while we're waiting, thank you all for that discussion. It was, I think we when we talked about these two meetings in June and July, we said this would be a two-parter, and I think that really has been terribly helpful today.
Sorry, Alison, I'm having connection problems. I'm going to duck out and come back in again.
Okay. Well, I hope we'll be starting shortly, so thank you if you do that.
Yeah.
I think Arthur and Anthony are on. Arthur's just coming up as an A and a blur. There's no picture of him, but Anthony's on.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. So do we have both Arthur Leithley and Anthony Smith on the call?
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Anthony Smith here, Chair.
Excellent. Thank you. Welcome. So we're just waiting for Arthur to... Can you hear us, Arthur?
I can hear you. I can see you, but you can't see me, it sounds like. No?
I can't at the moment, but that's fine. Assembly members will know that the briefing... we've had an opportunity to see all the information that's come through from Travel Watch. You've been asked to join the meeting. You were asked to join the meeting at 1:30. Our apologies for holding you up. As you know, the Transport Committee and the subject means we have long and involved discussions. So I apologise for keeping you waiting. So I would like to welcome to the meeting Arthur Leithley, who is the chair of London Travel Watch, and Anthony Smith, who is the chief executive of Transport Focus. I don't know whether one or other of you would like to just open the discussion with any brief remarks, if you'd like to make some comments, and then we'll move into a session of questions, a series of questions from members of the committee.
Thank you, Chair. And it was a very interesting session earlier, so I can understand why it took so long, but a lot of good discussion. If I could start off, if Anthony's okay with that. And thanks for inviting us today. First of all, apologies from Emma Gibson, our director, who would have liked to have been with you today, but she's actually in France on a pre-arranged holiday, so I'm sorry she couldn't join us today. But I just wanted to remind people, really, last time we appeared, which was in real life back in October, and we asked you to take a forward-looking decision to approve the partnership between Transport Focus and London Travel Watch. We had a brief discussion at that point, and we did say it would only be worthwhile if it benefited transport users and was useful to you. You took the bold step then, and 5 months ago we set up the agreement between Transport Focus and London Travel Watch, which I believe is already paying dividends. And I heard from the earlier discussion one aspect of work that we're doing around zip cards, but I think there have been others as well. And these have shown, I think, real value of the two organisations working together, but real benefits as well, direct benefits to passengers and to users. And unless there are those benefits, there's no point to the arrangement at all. I would like to pay tribute actually to both organisations and all their staff in the last few months. Obviously, everybody across the country, across the world has faced great difficulties, but I do think the staff have done amazing work in the last few months to adapt to a very different world. And of course, we only just had the agreement between the organisations a month before we had the biggest ever changes to transport in peacetime. So a bit of a challenge, and of course a big challenge to Emma, who joined as director, and this was still in her probation period. We haven't mentioned anything to do with pandemics as part of her probation checks. So I just really wanted to say that to start with. I think as a background, I think we're already seeing the changes coming through. You talked earlier about the zip card research, which I think has been very valuable to the debate. We pushed hard for 24/7 bus lanes, which we're delighted to see this week. TfL are introducing as an experiment, and we now have 24/7 access for passengers to an inquiries line, which we never had before. That's something that Transport Focus have had for some time. London travellers haven't had access to that in the past, and they do now. So they're just one or two early wins, but there are many others which I can happily talk through.
Okay. And Anthony, would you like to add anything briefly, or are you happy for us to move through into questions?
Just to say, Chair, thank you very much for seeing us today. I hope your faith in us has been rewarded over the last few months. I think Travel Watch has made great use of the huge amount of insight work that Transport Focus produces. And what I've seen is they've really been driving more of a difference for London's transport users in the last 6 months than I've seen in the 21 years in which I've been working in this sector, and I'm proud to admit. And I genuinely hope that you are starting to feel that London Travel Watch is being more useful to you. That is absolutely crucial in this relationship. We haven't finished this yet, we've only just started. And I think one interesting pointer for the future, of course, is Transport Focus is sponsored by the Department for Transport, very much at arm's length. But given the new prominence of the Department for Transport in debates in and around London, having a voice at the DFT table is probably not unhelpful. Thank you, Chair.
I'm sure that must be very helpful, and thank you. And I certainly, obviously I'm on a learning curve in terms of transport issues over the last couple of months, and actually I've found particularly the omnibus survey very, very helpful. But I also have the work around your campaign around the zip card has also been very impressive. Could I just kick off with a couple of questions, and then Councillor Assembly Member Pigeon will come in after that. How will the COVID-19 crisis impact on your 2021 business plan over the rest of the financial year? And how will London Travel Watch overcome barriers to progress?
So if I could answer that. You may be able to see me now. I don't know, Chair. I've got a new camera to put on. Yes. It may not be an improvement, but you can see me anyway.
We can definitely see you. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Yes, like everybody, we're having to adapt financially to what is happening, and that's a process that's being done through the Mayor's office, and clearly we're going to be looking at our budget for this current year and beyond. What I would say is that work was already happening, regardless of COVID. A lot of work that Anthony and I and our colleagues have been doing to get the best possible value from the two organisations working together. So we were already making savings in terms of IT, sharing finance, back office functions, HR, and London Travel Watch actually taking on the complaints function for both organisations. So there'd already been efficiency savings in only the weeks that we've been together ahead of the COVID crisis. But clearly we're going to have to look to other opportunities going forward. The key really is that we're still giving value to users and to yourselves, and we've got to balance that out, I think, in terms of what can we save. Saving money is one thing. If it doesn't give as good a service, we've got to weigh that up, and I think it's really important that we do give the best possible service to the users and yourselves. That Anthony may want to add.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think the business plan will continue in one form, which is we will continue responding to the COVID crisis on behalf of transport users, because clearly it's going to be with us for a while. I think last Friday and the changing messaging from government was very significant, because the use public transport message finally was clarified and is much more consistent. And I think the debate now moves on to getting passengers to feel it's safe, in inverted commas. Our research shows again and again is that people don't feel that the public transport system at the moment is, inverted commas, safe, although the research shows those people who are using it are finding it quite satisfactory, both in terms of the social distancing, slightly less so in terms of face coverings, because of course my safety is slightly dependent on you wearing a face covering. And I went on the tube last Friday night for the first time in 4 months, and I can't say it was a pleasant experience, to be honest. Wearing a mask on the Northern Line is hot and unpleasant, and by 11 o'clock in the evening, coming home on Friday night, some of the younger people who were in the carriage with us were not wearing masks, and that puts me at risk. And I think that enforcement and visible enforcement of face coverings is just going to be an absolutely key issue to restoring confidence. So I think there are lots of ongoing issues, but the research we've got will provide you with a continuous weekly feedback on how transport users are thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and you've answered most of my next question. Do you have anything, either of you have anything to add about how you're responding to the evolving transport environment beyond the comments you've already made?
No, I think really that is how we've been responding so far, and clearly we need to keep a close watch on things as they develop. We've seen there will be changes in policy happening, obviously, across from government and from the Mayor's office. We need to be very adept at dealing with that.
Thank you.
Nothing to add, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Russell, if you'd like to ask the next question.
Of course, Chair, thank you. I am wondering how London Travel Watch can play a stronger role in supporting active travel, given the importance that active travel is now playing in order to help maintain our physical distance from each other.
Yes, I mean, we're just about to launch in August our own proposals for active travel, and I think some of the discussion that was had this morning will be very useful for us in developing those plans. But the advantage we have at London Travel Watch, of course, is that we do look right across the modes, and it's not about putting one mode of travel across ahead of any other. It's about how we get that balance. But clearly, with the active travel opportunities and the need for social distance, it gives a new perspective, I think, to that. So we are going to be pushing very hard around certainly the cycling and pedestrian activities. And a lot of this, obviously, is certainly around the streetscape and the work that Transport for London are doing. And we're very, very closely involved with Transport for London, Will Norman's team and others in setting that up.
There's one thing that in particular came up this morning, is when you have sort of multimodal journeys, which many people do, they may cycle to the station and then get on a train or the underground and then make the rest of their journey maybe on a hire bike or on foot. There's a real need for kind of mapping of the new facilities in particular that are around, and I think if Travel Watch can play some kind of part in helping the push to make sure that all of the new facilities are well mapped. You've done a lot of good work on mapping of rail and rail stations, and I think sort of one of the gaps at the moment in terms of active travel is having they're doing so much work so quickly and changing our streets so fast that actually that kind of mapping of what's available and the route choices is something where there's a bit of a need for a bit of a push and a catch up.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you may remember that was a pressure we put on Transport for London and London Underground, particularly to show on the tube maps that stations could easily be walked between. And it was amazing the difference that made. People might expect people to know, how would you know if you're travelling in London for the first time? And it just made things much clearer. So you're absolutely right. I think as things are adjusting now, we need to do much more of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Assembly Member Pigeon.
Could I come to Arthur first and then Anthony with the same question? Are the new working arrangements with Transport Focus delivering as expected? And I guess, Anthony, it would be the flip with Travel Watch.
Well, certainly from my perspective, in fact, I would say they're working better than I expected. I think, especially in view of the changes that started in March, I think if we'd have achieved what we have done in normal times, I think we'd have been pretty pleased. To have done that in the midst of the pandemic, I think has been remarkable. But it has been things, for instance, penalty fares. When between us, we spotted very quickly that penalty fares that people were being charged an unreasonable amount. They were being charged at just a peak rate, even if they were travelling off peak. We were very quick on that. I think having both organisations push at that simultaneously and quickly, it led to a very quick change. So I think that was just one example very quickly, but there'll be others that come through as well. But Anthony, I'm sure, will have his own thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Arthur. Yes, I think it's working extremely well from Transport Focus's point of view. Having London's expertise and knowledge and experience more clearly located in our national thinking is absolutely important. I mean, people often say London's a bubble, and it slightly annoys me when they say that, because London's what it is, and the rest of the country is different. Of course it is. But the cross-learning that we're already seeing between London and the rest of the country, particularly on things like bus services, is really, really useful. And I think the organisational energy of both places has really gone up. And in particular, I would say that Emma Gibson is an outstanding leader. She's a member of our management team now. She's quite challenging. She's been pushing us on diversity issues, which is great. And I think it's working extremely well.
Well, I have to say, from my perspective on the Transport Committee, it's like a different organisation, and the information we get, also if we feedback suggestions, they're taken up. It's what we had dreamt of many years ago, but it's taken quite a while to get there. But thank you for the work you and Arthur are doing. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
That's tremendous. And I know Assembly Member Prince wants to come in, but I have one quick question before we do. How are you measuring the impact of your initiatives and lobbying? Do you have?
Yes, so we're setting up a different system than we've had before, essentially sort of RAG rating. So those elements where we actually achieve, we've got indicators of success. And if we're not making the progress, we'll mark those as red. But so far we're seeing progress, and on the whole we're able to put things down as green or amber to show that things are developing. But you're absolutely right to ask the question. How do we measure ourselves is one of the challenges. But I think some of the feedback, such as we've just had from Assembly Member Pigeon, but also from other people, is a good indication of how stakeholders see us. And we will be doing a survey quite shortly, and that will be coming to Assembly members. to understand what people's view of us is, and we expect that to be sort of warts and all. And we want to know what we're doing well and what we're not doing well, and what you want more of. And we'll work towards that. So that will give us a very clear benchmark. And obviously from this year into future years, I hope we're going to see improvements.
I think, Chair, there's only two ways you can really gauge the success of organisations like ours, one of which is to ask any passengers or members of the public who contact us what they think about that experience. Every single complainant who comes to Travelwatch is asked about, after their case is closed, about the opinion of how well it was handled, so that's not bad feedback. And secondly, I think you just have to ask your stakeholders like yourselves, who you're seeking to influence and be useful to, are we influential and useful? And if so, yes, why? If no, why? Because we want to improve. And it's not utterly scientific, but in the absence of competition, which there isn't a lot of in our sector, I think that's probably about the best we can offer you.
Okay. Thank you very much. That is very much appreciated, and we will look forward to the survey now. If I could finally bring Assembly Member Prince in. Has he made it back on?
Thank you. And I did suggest that I'll drop my question. I'll pass on my warts over to Arthur when I get the survey. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I missed your message. Well, look,
thank you.
Because I couldn't see you. That's fine. So, if nobody else has any questions for Arthur or Anthony, can I thank you both very much for waiting as long as you did to come in and speak to us, and we really very much appreciate it. And I will cover in my formal formal remarks at the end the issue around your board members. So if I may. Can we note London Travelwatch's annual performance and the financial position as at 31st of March 2020, the report and our discussion this afternoon?
Noted.
And can we also agree a one-year extension to the period of appointment for the 3 London Travelwatch board members whose terms of appointment are currently due to expire on the 31st of December 2020, as set out in paragraph 4.2 of the report, subject to satisfactory performance reviews?
Agreed. Sorry, agreed.
So, thank you. So that is agreed, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And in addition to the recommendations on the agenda, I would like to propose that the committee prepares a joint response to the Department of Transport's consultation on creating a plan to decarbonise transport with the London Assembly's Environment Committee, and that the committee responds to the TfL consultation on extending bus hours. Do members have any questions or comments related to either of these proposals?
Agreed.
Agreed. Can we note the work programme?
Noted.
And can we agree to delegate authority to me as Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group lead members to agree a joint response with the Chair of the Environment Committee to the Department of Transport's consultation on creating a plan to decarbonise transport?
Agreed.
Can we also agree to delegate authority to me as Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group lead members to agree a response to TfL's consultation on extended bus lane hours?
Agreed.
Yes. The next meeting of the Transport Committee will be confirmed in due course by the London Assembly. And I'll remove my phone before I bang the gavel and the website and close the meeting. Thank you.